Introduction. Growing up on Mars. Imagine a scenario where your eldest child, having just reached the age of 10, is selected by a visionary billionaire for the first permanent human settlement on Mars. Her academic record, combined with a genetic analysis you never consented to, secured her position. Seduced by the allure of space and the knowledge that her peers are also enlisting, she begs you for permission to embark on this journey. Upon investigating, you discover that the mission recruits children because their developing bodies are theorized to adapt more readily to Martian conditions, such as its low gravity. Whether they could ever survive a return to Earth remains entirely unknown. The physical dangers are immense. Earth's magnetosphere provides a vital shield against solar winds and cosmic rays, a protection Mars severely lacks. The resulting radiation would aggressively bombard a child's rapidly dividing cells, presenting a catastrophic cancer risk. Furthermore, millions of years of evolution have optimized the human body for Earth's specific gravitational pull. In a low-gravity environment, children face severe skeletal, cardiovascular, and neurological deformities. The company organizing the settlement has conducted no research on these developmental hazards. More alarmingly, they require no verifiable parental consent. A simple checked box by the child is enough to authorize her departure. Naturally, you would refuse. The idea of surrendering a child to a corporation that entirely disregards developmental safety and parental authority is deeply insane. Yet a parallel experiment has already been unleashed upon our youth. At the dawn of the new millennium, a wave of techno-optimism swept the globe as technology companies unveiled internet-based products that revolutionized communication and daily life. The architects of these platforms were celebrated as modern-day Prometheans, delivering divine gifts of connectivity to humanity. However, this revolution did not spare the young. By the time smartphones became ubiquitous, parents found a convenient, mesmerizing tool capable of pacifying toddlers and teenagers alike. It was universally assumed to be safe, but these corporations had conducted negligible research into the psychological and developmental impacts of their inventions. Driven by the imperative to maximize engagement, they deployed potent psychological mechanisms to capture the attention of children during their most vulnerable developmental windows. Social media platforms disproportionately impacted girls, while immersive video games and boundless internet access seized the minds of boys. This constant barrage of digital stimulation displaced essential physical play and face-to-face interaction, fundamentally rewiring the landscape of childhood on a scale previously unimaginable. The legal frameworks intended to protect minors have proven entirely inadequate. In the United States, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act of 1998 established 13 as the minimum age for data collection without parental consent. This arbitrary threshold was implemented without age verification mechanisms, allowing any child with a falsified birth year to access the unfiltered depths of the internet. The digital ecosystem operates with the same aggressive disregard for adolescent welfare as the tobacco industry of the mid-20th century, or the oil companies that willfully ignored the developmental neurotoxicity of leaded gasoline. While adults can navigate the digital world and weigh its substantial benefits against its risks, the adolescent brain cannot. The prefrontal cortex, which governs impulse control and delays gratification, remains deeply underdeveloped during the very years that social insecurity and susceptibility to peer pressure peak. Sending children into this unregulated digital expanse is akin to sending them to mature on Mars. The generation born after 1995, commonly known as Generation Z, became the first to experience puberty, completely enveloped by this new digital reality. The oldest members of this cohort reached their sensitive developmental milestones right as the iPhone gained dominance, high-speed broadband proliferated, and social media evolved into a hyper-viral ecosystem. The introduction of like and share functions in 2009 radically altered online social dynamics, transforming simple communication into a relentless pursuit of validation. The subsequent integration of front-facing smartphone cameras and the meteoric rise of image curation platforms forced adolescents into a perpetual state of brand management. Peer acceptance, the vital currency of adolescence, became contingent upon navigating an addictive, unstable, and often toxic virtual universe. Simultaneously, a second, equally destructive cultural shift was taking place: the systematic erosion of the play-based childhood. Across mammalian species, unstructured, free play is essential for healthy development. It provides a low-stakes environment where young minds encounter small challenges, learn to navigate social friction, and develop intrinsic resilience. Yet, beginning in the 1980s, an acute culture of parental fearfulness took hold. Driven by exaggerated perceptions of physical danger, adults restricted children's autonomy in the real world. Unsupervised outdoor play collapsed just as personal electronics became sophisticated and deeply engaging. Adolescence transitioned from a childhood anchored in physical reality to one dictated by screens. This profound dual failure, severe overprotection in the physical world and absolute underprotection in the virtual world, created the perfect conditions for a devastating epidemic of mental illness. To understand this crisis, we must differentiate the real world from the virtual world. Real-world interactions are embodied. We communicate with physical presence, responding consciously and unconsciously to the bodies of others. They are synchronous, demanding the subtle mastery of timing and turn-taking. They occur primarily one-to-one or in small groups, within communities where exiting requires effort and maintaining relationships demands genuine investment. Conversely, the virtual world is disembodied, relying on asynchronous text and curated images. It is characterized by one-to-many broadcasting within transient communities where the barrier to entry and exit is practically non-existent, rendering relationships disposable. While humanity evolved over millions of years to thrive in the former, children are now being raised almost entirely within the latter, deprived of the very mechanisms that teach emotional regulation and interpersonal commitment. The collapse of adolescent mental health is an intricate tragedy demanding a systemic response. Over the course of the 20th century, society successfully implemented guardrails for dangerous innovations, from mandating seatbelts in automobiles to restricting the sale of tobacco to minors. It is now imperative that similar boundaries are established for the digital age. A foundation for a healthier childhood requires collective action to implement profound yet practically cost-free societal changes. We must delay the introduction of smartphones, providing only basic devices until high school. We must withhold access to social media until the age of 16, allowing the vulnerable adolescent brain to mature before subjecting it to the fire hose of algorithmic comparison. We must establish entirely phone-free school environments to reclaim students' attention for learning and real-world connection. Finally, we must actively restore unsupervised play and childhood independence. The wisdom of antiquity consistently warns against surrendering the sovereignty of the mind to external forces. Stoic philosophers like Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius cautioned against the profound vulnerability that comes from obsessing over the opinions, actions, and judgments of others. Today, the endless scroll of digital feeds has industrialized this very distraction, scattering our focus and exhausting our spirits. This is not merely an issue of parenting or technology management, it is a fundamental question of what it means to live a flourishing human life. The task before us is to reclaim the architecture of childhood and in doing so, bring our children back to earth. Chapter 1. The Surge of Suffering. When speaking with the parents of teenagers, the dialogue frequently shifts toward the pervasive influence of digital devices, social networks, and virtual gaming. The accounts shared often weave into familiar tapestries of struggle. One recurring theme is the relentless tug-of-war over boundaries. Caregivers attempt to establish guidelines and curb screen time, yet the sheer volume of available electronics, combined with endless negotiations and clever workarounds, transforms domestic life into an unending battleground over technology. Preserving family traditions and fundamental interpersonal bonds can feel akin to standing against an encroaching flood that threatens to submerge both the young and the old. For many of these families, the primary concern is not rooted in a clinical diagnosis, but rather in a profound unease that something fundamentally unnatural is unfolding. There is a palpable fear that their children are forfeiting essential life experiences, perhaps life itself, as their hours vanish into the digital ether. Yet, occasionally the narratives take on a much grimmer tone. Mothers and fathers describe the agonizing sensation of losing their child entirely. Consider the story of a family striving to shield their young daughter from the toxic comparisons of image-based platforms. Despite their best efforts to deploy monitoring software and limit access, the home became a theater of constant friction. The situation escalated to the point where the daughter, bypassed the digital locks and issued severe threats of self-harm if the restrictions were reinstated. The mother lamented that the only viable solution seemed to be isolation on a remote island. During device-free summer camps, her daughter's vibrant personality would miraculously resurface, only to evaporate into sullen agitation the moment the screen was returned. Temporary confiscations and the substitution of a basic flip phone produced similar restorations of her former self. When the focus turns to young men, the culprit is often immersive video gaming, sometimes coupled with easily accessible adult content rather than social media. The transition from casual play to heavy, isolating gaming can be stark. A father shared the trajectory of his adolescent son, whose life had been on a positive track with academics and martial arts before the pandemic. To cope with school closures, the family introduced a gaming console. Initially, it provided welcome entertainment and a semblance of social interaction. However, as the hours dedicated to virtual battlefields multiplied, a profound behavioral shift occurred. A tide of hostility, lethargy, and gloom emerged. Attempts to confiscate the electronics resulted in aggressive withdrawal symptoms and isolation. The parents felt cornered, realizing that their son's only remaining social ties were anchored in the virtual realm, making complete severance feel like an impossible cruelty. Regardless of the specific details or the severity of the situation, a unifying thread binds these parental experiences. A profound sense of entrapment and helplessness. Very few caregivers desire a childhood mediated primarily through screens for their offspring, yet the societal landscape has morphed so drastically that resisting this digital tide feels synonymous with condemning one's child to social exile. The evidence points to a monumental shift that occurred in the early 2010s, a period that witnessed a precipitous decline in the psychological well-being of the youth. Before delving into the statistical proof of this crisis, it is crucial to honor the voices of those who feel their children have been swept away by an unseen current, and who are fighting desperately to pull them back to safety. During the first decade of the new millennium, there were minimal indicators forecasting a psychological crisis among adolescents. Then, with jarring suddenness, the landscape altered in the early 2010s. While any individual manifestation of psychological distress is woven from a complex tapestry of genetic predispositions, early life events, and broader societal influences, the focal point here is the synchronized international escalation of psychological afflictions between 2010 and 2015. This phenomenon disproportionately impacted the generation born after 1995, leaving older cohorts relatively untouched. To understand this, one must examine why rates of pervasive sadness and chronic worry spiked simultaneously across numerous borders. Data collected annually by federal health agencies tracking youth behavior and well-being reveal a stark inflection point. Surveys querying teenagers about prolonged periods of emptiness, loss of interest in previously enjoyed activities, and other indicators of severe emotional distress display a dramatic upward trajectory beginning around 2012. For young women, the sheer volume of new cases was staggering, creating a sharply angled curve that signals a crisis. While young men started from a lower baseline, their relative percentage increase was remarkably similar, effectively multiplying the prevalence of these profound depressive episodes by 2.5 times within a decade. This surge was indiscriminate, sweeping across diverse racial and socio-economic demographics. By the time the world entered the pandemic era, an alarming proportion of adolescent girls had already experienced a debilitating emotional descent, confirming that the foundation of this crisis was cemented well before global lockdowns exacerbated the isolation. To decipher this sudden deterioration, it is necessary to identify the specific nature of the suffering and its timeline. A crucial revelation is that this epidemic is primarily defined by internalizing conditions, those where the individual absorbs the distress, manifesting as paralyzing fear, profound sadness, and a retreat from social connection. This stands in contrast to externalizing behaviors, where distress is directed outward through aggression, rule-breaking, or dangerous risk-taking. Historically, females have been more susceptible to the former and males to the latter. However, the post-2010 era witnessed a surge in internalizing symptoms across both genders, accompanied by a simultaneous decline in outward rebellious behaviors. This internalizing wave is distinctly concentrated within the generation born in the late 1990s and onward. Psychological evaluations of university populations mirror this trend, showing that diagnoses for pervasive worry and deep melancholy have eclipsed all other mental health categories, driving the overall rise in campus psychological crises during the 2010s. The data clearly isolates this phenomenon. While the youngest demographic bracket experienced a sharp escalation in persistent nervousness starting in 2012, older generations maintained relatively stable and in some cases declining levels of similar distress. To fully grasp the crisis, one must distinguish between natural apprehension and clinical disorder. The human capacity to anticipate and react to physical and social threats is an evolutionary masterpiece, critical for survival. When a genuine danger is imminent, an ancient alarm system triggers a cascade of physiological responses: muscle tension, heightened alertness, the release of stress hormones, preparing the body to react before the conscious mind has even fully processed the threat. Once the danger passes, the alarm silences and equilibrium returns. This is healthy, situational apprehension. However, when this finely tuned alarm system becomes hypersensitive, frequently detonating in the absence of actual peril, it traps the individual in a state of perpetual physiological and emotional siege. This persistent anticipation of future harm, often focused on the terrifying prospect of social ostracization or humiliation, paralyzes the mind. It manifests physically as tightness in the chest and exhaustion, and cognitively as an inescapable loop of catastrophic thinking. The sufferer becomes entangled in distorted interpretations of reality, where minor social friction is magnified into impending doom, perpetuating the very physiological symptoms that reinforce the panic. Trailing closely behind this pervasive worry is a profound emotional desolation. This condition is characterized by an enduring emptiness and a devastating inability to derive pleasure from life. It drains the color from existence, often accompanied by severe disruptions in sleep, appetite, and energy. The mind turns inward, obsessing over perceived inadequacies and generating a crushing weight of guilt. In this state of profound disconnection and hopelessness, the permanence of death can begin to appear as the only logical escape from an endless corridor of suffering. Crucially, this emotional abyss is deeply intertwined with social isolation. A lack of meaningful human connection accelerates the descent, while the condition itself strips the individual of the desire and energy to seek the very relationships that might offer a lifeline. Initially, some observers dismissed this statistical surge as a phantom phenomenon, suggesting it merely reflected a generation more willing to discuss their emotions or prone to mislabeling ordinary teenage angst as pathology. They argued that self-reported surveys were an unreliable metric for actual disease. While increased destigmatization of psychological struggles is a positive societal shift, dismissing the crisis as mere linguistic inflation ignores grim behavioral realities. The most unassailable evidence that a genuine catastrophe occurred in the early 2010s lies in the medical records of emergency departments. Admissions for deliberate, non-fatal self-injury among young adolescents, particularly preteen and young teenage girls, skyrocketed during this period. These acts, often involving intentional laceration or the ingestion of toxins, are profound indicators of overwhelming psychic pain. They are coping mechanisms employed when emotional agony becomes unendurable. Concurrently, the ultimate tragedy, the rate of young lives lost to their own hands, began a terrifying ascent around 2008, surging drastically throughout the subsequent decade. This behavioral data silences the skeptics. The alignment of self-reported misery with a massive increase in self-destructive actions confirms that the environment of childhood underwent a toxic mutation. The timeline of this psychological collapse aligns perfectly with the rapid adoption of a revolutionary communication tool. While the initial wave of the internet, tethered to desktop computers, integrated into homes during the 1990s without triggering a corresponding mental health crisis, the second wave was vastly different. The combination of portable, internet-enabled touchscreens and the specific architecture of modern social networking created a profoundly altered ecosystem. Before 2009, digital interaction was largely a tool for maintaining existing relationships. However, the introduction of mechanisms that quantified approval, such as the ability to endorse or broadcast a peer's statement, transformed communication into a relentless public performance. The subsequent addition of outward-facing lenses on mobile devices and the acquisition of image-centric platforms by dominant tech conglomerates hypercharged this dynamic. Adolescence, already a crucible of social insecurity, was abruptly relocated into an alternative universe where peer acceptance, the very lifeblood of the teenage experience, was measured in real-time metrics and subjected to the merciless judgment of an unseen crowd. This generation became the first to navigate the delicate neurological and social transformations of puberty while carrying a portal to a highly addictive, unstable, and often cruel virtual reality in their pockets. The imperative to curate a flawless digital identity displaced the messy, embodied, and essential physical play that had characterized human childhood for millennia. As the hours dedicated to virtual scrolling and immersive digital entertainment ballooned, the time available for face-to-face interaction, physical movement, and deep restorative rest evaporated. This was not merely a change in habits. It was the great rewiring of the developing brain. Some attempt to explain this despair by pointing to the genuine turbulence of the modern world: economic instability, environmental degradation, and geopolitical strife. However, this argument unravels under scrutiny. Historical precedents demonstrate that generations facing existential threats, from world wars to economic depressions, do not typically respond with mass clinical depression. Instead, shared external threats often foster social cohesion, purpose, and a sense of collective resilience. Furthermore, the timing contradicts the theory. If macroeconomic forces were the primary driver, the psychological collapse should have occurred during the depths of the global financial crisis and subsequently eased during the economic recovery of the 2010s. The data shows the exact opposite. Moreover, an awareness of global existential threats should theoretically impact older, more politically aware young adults more severely than preteens. Yet it is the youngest adolescents, particularly girls, who have suffered the most acute increases in psychological distress. The world has always been fraught with peril. What changed was not the sudden onset of tragedy, but the mechanism by which it was consumed. A constant, algorithmic drip of catastrophe, perfectly calibrated to induce anxiety and outrage, replaced the localized, embodied reality that children are evolutionarily equipped to navigate. The assertion that this is a uniquely American phenomenon, driven by specific national anxieties or policies, also fails. An examination of culturally aligned nations reveals a synchronized pattern of distress. In countries that largely avoided the brunt of the financial crisis and lack the pervasive anxieties of frequent violence or extreme economic precarity, the psychological health of young women went into an identical freefall starting precisely in the early 2010s. Emergency psychiatric interventions for self-harm across these varied geographies trace the exact same terrifying upward curve. This synchronization extends beyond the English-speaking world. Nations known for robust social safety nets and high indices of general happiness witnessed an indistinguishable surge in psychological distress among their youth during the exact same window. Global educational surveys measuring a sense of belonging within school environments chart a sudden, worldwide increase in feelings of intense isolation and alienation precisely as the smartphone became an omnipresent fixture in the pockets of students. The weight of the evidence points to a singular, inescapable conclusion. The rapid, near-universal transition from a childhood anchored in physical reality and unstructured play to one dominated by continuous, disembodied virtual connection constitutes the largest, unconsented sociological experiment in human history. By relocating the fragile process of adolescent development into a digital ecosystem engineered for engagement rather than well-being, society has inadvertently triggered a tidal wave of psychological suffering. Chapter 3. Discover Mode and the Need for Risky Play. In recent decades, modern Western societies have made two deeply contradictory decisions regarding the safety of their young, and both have proven disastrous. On one hand, society concluded that the physical world is too perilous for children to navigate without constant adult supervision, even though objective dangers from crime and traffic have plummeted since the 1990s. On the other hand, establishing age-appropriate guardrails in the virtual world was deemed too complicated, leaving minors to wander freely through the digital frontier where genuine threats are ubiquitous. The profound irony is that while parents obsess over keeping their children physically protected from unlikely abductions, the actual predators have migrated online. The internet has created an easily accessible ecosystem where predatory adults can effortlessly contact minors, and where children themselves stumble into explicit, adult-oriented content with horrifying ease. A young teenager's essay perfectly captured this absurdity. She described encountering pornography online at the age of 10 on a platform lacking basic age verification, all while her attentive mother was in the next room meticulously curating a diet of multicolored vegetables to ensure her perfect health. To genuinely protect children, the formula must be inverted. We must delay their immersion into the unpoliced virtual world and actively send them back into the physical world to play. Unsupervised outdoor play is the mechanism that teaches children how to manage risk, building the physical and psychological competence that acts as a natural vaccine against anxiety. Discover mode versus defend mode. The evolutionary environment of our hominid ancestors was defined by extreme volatility, oscillating between periods of safety and sudden, lethal peril. To survive, the human brain developed two distinct, specialized operating systems to navigate these changing realities. The first is the behavioral activation system, or what can be termed discover mode. This system ignites when opportunities arise, such as discovering a cache of ripe fruit. It floods the body with positive emotion, suppresses fear, and readies the individual to explore and engage. The opposing system is the behavioral inhibition system, or defend mode. When a threat is detected, like the rustle of a predator in the brush, this system instantly suppresses appetite, floods the body with stress hormones, and focuses all cognitive resources on evasion and survival. Together, these systems function like a psychological thermostat. Across the animal kingdom, an organism's default setting is dictated by its evolutionary history. Apex predators and island-dwelling herbivores naturally default to discover mode. They are confident and inquisitive because they face few daily threats. Conversely, prey animals like rabbits are perpetually skittish. Their default is defend mode, and they shift out of it only with extreme caution. In humans, this default setting profoundly influences personality. Individuals who navigate life primarily in discover mode are eager, sociable, and resilient. Those who are chronically trapped in defend mode perceive novelty and social friction as existential threats. While chronic wariness may have kept our ancestors alive in hostile environments, being locked in defend mode today severely obstructs a child's capacity for growth and learning in a relatively safe modern world. Students on the defensive. The implications of these default modes become glaringly apparent when observing young adults entering higher education. A student whose childhood experiences calibrated their brain toward discover mode will arrive on a university campus hungry for intellectual exploration. They will view the boundless social and academic opportunities as a playground for personal growth. In contrast, a student trapped in defend mode will view the same environment with a scarcity mindset, retreating to the safety of an ideological or social tribe and demanding protection from uncomfortable ideas. This stark contrast explains the dramatic cultural shift that overtook university campuses around 2014. As the last of the millennial generation departed and the first wave of Generation Z arrived, the exuberant, opportunity-seeking culture evaporated. It was rapidly replaced by a deeply anxious atmosphere where students began labeling ordinary words, books, and visiting speakers as dangerous or traumatizing. The surge in overwhelmed college counseling centers was driven almost entirely by skyrocketing rates of anxiety and depression, confirming that an entire generation was arriving on campus structurally locked in defend mode. Kids are anti-fragile. In the late 1980s, an ambitious scientific endeavor called Biosphere 2 attempted to construct a fully enclosed, self-sustaining ecosystem in the Arizona desert. While the project suffered many failures, one was particularly instructive. The trees planted in the artificial rainforest grew rapidly, but inexplicably collapsed before reaching maturity. The scientists soon realized the missing ingredient was wind. In nature, when wind violently bends a young tree, it causes microscopic cellular damage. In response, the tree generates stress wood. altering its cellular structure to become thicker and stronger, while expanding its root system for better anchorage. Trees shielded in a perfect greenhouse simply collapse under their own weight. Stress wood provides a flawless metaphor for human childhood. It illustrates the concept of anti-fragility, a term introduced by the scholar Nassim Taleb. Fragile items, like crystal glasses, must be protected because shocks break them. Resilient items, like plastic cups, survive shocks but do not improve. Anti-fragile systems, however, require shocks, stresses, and disorder to grow stronger. The human immune system is a prime example. A child raised in a sterile bubble will develop severe autoimmune issues because the system requires exposure to dirt and pathogens to calibrate itself. The psychological immune system operates on the exact same principle. Children must experience frustrations, minor injuries, social exclusion, and playground teasing to develop the emotional calluses necessary for adulthood. Happiness is not achieved by eliminating all external triggers from a child's life, but by allowing the child to build the internal fortitude to prevent external events from triggering emotional collapse. Well-meaning parents who attempt to create a friction-free existence for their offspring are actively stunting their development. This intensive coddling directly correlates with the rise of anxiety disorders and low self-efficacy, as it denies the child the very stresses required to build an anti-fragile mind. Anti-fragile kids need risky play to stay in discover mode. Understanding anti-fragility solves a long-standing developmental puzzle. Why do children actively inject risk into their play? Once a child masters riding a bike on flat pavement, why do they immediately seek out a steep hill or a makeshift ramp, guaranteeing a painful crash? Play researchers note that thrilling, slightly dangerous experiences serve an essential antiphobic function. Clinical psychology reveals that human phobias are heavily concentrated around ancient evolutionary threats, snakes, heights, enclosed spaces, and darkness, rather than modern killers like automobiles or fast food. We are biologically prepared to fear these ancient dangers. However, as children expose themselves to manageable doses of these fears, they develop competence. A child who repeatedly climbs trees and occasionally falls will usually grow into an adult entirely unafraid of heights. Through risky play, the paralyzing grip of fear transforms into the exhilaration of mastery. Like a cautious puppy learning to navigate a dog park by darting toward larger animals and sprinting away, children constantly toggle between discover and defend modes, calibrating their exact tolerance for risk. Researchers categorize these necessary childhood thrills into distinct domains: experiencing great heights, high speeds, dangerous tools, hazardous elements like fire, rough-and-tumble physical wrestling, and the thrill of hiding or wandering away. These physical experiences cannot be simulated. A video game avatar plummeting from a virtual cliff provides zero physical or psychological benefit. Decades ago, playground equipment like fast-spinning merry-go-rounds inherently understood this need, forcing children to negotiate physical forces, cooperate to generate speed, and manage the genuine, though minor, risk of falling off. Today, such equipment has been systematically eradicated due to the threat of litigation, replaced by ultra-safe, low-to-the-ground plastic structures that offer no opportunity to learn how to avoid injury. Yet, the evidence clearly shows that unstructured physical play, even with its inherent risks of cuts and bruises, produces healthier, more resilient children than heavily supervised adult sports. The goal of childhood spaces should be to keep children as safe as necessary, not as safe as humanly possible. Some argue that children can develop this anti-fragility online by navigating digital conflicts. However, the virtual world lacks the crucial elements of the physical world. Real-world conflicts are embodied, synchronous, and low-cost. A playground spat can be resolved instantly with a handshake or an apologetic facial expression, teaching relationship repair. In contrast, online mistakes are disembodied, asynchronous, and high-cost. A misstep on social media can invite viral, permanent shaming from thousands of disconnected strangers, offering no clear path for redemption. Instead of building resilience, the digital world often leaves adolescents feeling socially incompetent and perpetually anxious. The beginning of the end of play-based childhood. When asked at what age they were first allowed to roam their neighborhoods unsupervised, individuals born before 1980 almost universally recall being liberated at age 6, 7, or 8. For Generation Z, the answers shift drastically to 10, 11, or 12. The systemic eradication of childhood autonomy began in the 1990s. Despite women entering the workforce in unprecedented numbers and overall leisure time shrinking, data shows that parents suddenly began spending significantly more hours directly supervising their children. This shift severely compressed the time available for unstructured free play. Sociological research from this era identified a growing divide in child-rearing philosophies. Middle and upper-class parents increasingly adopted concerted cultivation, viewing their children as delicate projects that required relentless adult-led enrichment to survive the cutthroat race of future college admissions. Children's schedules were packed with supervised activities, leaving no room for the neighborhood wandering that had previously been the bedrock of childhood social development. Fearful parenting in the Anglosphere. However, the hyper-competitive pressure of college admissions cannot fully explain the concurrent collapse of childhood independence in nations like the United Kingdom and Canada, where educational pathways are less frantic. The deeper, more pervasive driver was a media-fueled contagion of parental fear. During the 1980s and 1990s, the advent of continuous cable news cycles amplified horrifying, anomalous stories of child abduction and abuse. High-profile scandals, some real and some entirely fabricated moral panics involving bizarre satanic rituals at daycares, convinced the public that no adult could be trusted with a child. The ubiquitous campaign against stranger danger fundamentally altered community dynamics. Adults internalized the message that they should never interact with or discipline other people's children. Consequently, the informal network of neighborhood supervision evaporated. Parents felt entirely alone in their burden of protection. By the early 2000s, an unaccompanied child walking to a local park had transitioned from a normal societal sight into a scandalous anomaly, often prompting fearful citizens to dial emergency services and subject the parents to grueling investigations by child welfare authorities. Safetyism and concept creep. This cultural transformation was aided by a psychological phenomenon known as concept creep, where definitions of trauma, abuse, and safety aggressively expanded. For generations, safety referred strictly to the avoidance of physical injury. However, leading up to the 2010s, the definition ballooned to include emotional safety. This new interpretation dictated that individuals possessed a fundamental right to be shielded from any experience, idea, or word that provoked negative feelings or discomfort. When a culture elevates the elimination of all potential harm above all other competing virtues, it embraces safetyism. This ideology demands the removal of all friction from a child's life. Schools began banning traditional physical games like tag or dodgeball to prevent bruised feelings, while parents enforced rigid rules preventing their preteens from playing unsupervised in their own front yards. This obsessive risk aversion systematically denied children the localized adversity they desperately needed to mature. Anti-fragility and the attachment system. The consequences of safetyism are best understood through the biological lens of the mammalian attachment system. Mammalian offspring endure a long period of vulnerability during which they must achieve two contradictory objectives. They must stay close enough to their mother to avoid being eaten, while simultaneously venturing outward to practice the survival skills required for adulthood. A healthy attachment system functions beautifully. A parent serves as a secure base. A toddler, operating in discover mode, crawls away to explore a novel environment. When they encounter a frightening stimulus, a loud noise, or a strange animal, defend mode instantly overrides and the child scurries back to the safety of the adult. Once comforted, the child recalibrates and ventures out again. Through thousands of these microcycles, the child internalizes the feeling of security and requires the physical presence of the parent less and less. By adolescence, this internal working model of attachment is transferred onto peers and romantic partners. However, overprotective parenting actively sabotages this biological mechanism. By constantly hovering and neutralizing every potential environmental threat, fearful parents trap their children on the secure base. The child is denied the vital off-base excursions necessary to conquer their fears. Deprived of the friction that triggers anti-fragile growth, these children are conditioned to view the world exclusively through the lens of defend mode, locking them in a permanent state of dependency and chronic anxiety. In sum, The architecture of the human brain features two primary operating states: discover mode, which seeks out opportunities and novel experiences, and defend mode, which remains hypervigilant against perceived threats. Gen Z is the first generation to be systematically conditioned to remain trapped in defend mode. Because children are biologically anti-fragile, they require exposure to physical thrills, social friction, and manageable risks to conquer their innate fears and build genuine competence. Unfortunately, beginning in the 1990s, an epidemic of fearful parenting and media-driven panic birthed the culture of safetyism, which confined children to the protective base of constant adult supervision. By abandoning the historically normal play-based childhood, where unsupervised exploration fosters resilience, and substituting it with the highly curated, high-stakes environment of a phone-based existence, society has inadvertently deprived youth of the exact real-world experiences required to mature into confident, self-reliant adults. Chapter 4: Puberty and the Blocked Transition to Adulthood. When we seek to understand the profound metamorphosis of children into adults, we often turn to the natural world, drawing comparisons to a caterpillar transforming into a butterfly. Yet this analogy falls short. A caterpillar seals itself within a chrysalis and undergoes a biological overhaul entirely isolated from external influences. The human transition, however, is deeply interactive. The journey from child to adult relies not just on biological maturation, but crucially on encountering the right sequences of experiences at precisely the right developmental moments to properly guide the rapid rewiring of the adolescent mind. Puberty, plasticity, and vulnerability. As explored previously, the human brain achieves the vast majority of its physical volume by the time a child reaches 5 years of age. At this early stage, the brain contains far more neural pathways and connections than it will ever need or retain in adulthood. Therefore, the subsequent years of cognitive development are not characterized by physical growth, but rather by an aggressive pruning process. The governing neurological principle is that neurons activated simultaneously will strengthen their connections. If an adolescent spends their pivotal developmental years practicing a musical instrument, playing team sports, or navigating the intricate social dynamics of unstructured play, those specific neural circuits will solidify. Conversely, if those years are consumed by endless scrolling on social media or retreating into video games, those heavily trafficked digital pathways will become the brain's dominant architecture. Alongside this pruning is a process known as myelination, where the brain's most frequently used neural pathways are coated in a fatty insulating sheath, dramatically accelerating the speed of cognitive transmission. This creates a profound developmental trade-off. A young child's brain is brimming with infinite potential but lacks specialized efficiency. As pruning and myelination accelerate during early puberty, the brain sacrifices that boundless potential for adult-level competence and speed. This neurological lockdown is akin to wet cement. While it is wet, impressions can be made easily, but they may wash away. Once it fully dries, no new marks can be left. But during that critical transitional phase, puberty, the impressions made are cemented permanently into the architecture of the mind. Because of this heightened plasticity, adolescence is a window of immense opportunity, but also of profound vulnerability. It is not inherently a period of distress, but it is a time when the brain is uniquely susceptible to the damages of sustained stress. While chronic, inescapable stress is deeply detrimental to the developing brain, short-term, acute stressors like navigating a playground dispute or failing at a difficult task are the exact stimuli required to build an anti-fragile mind. Experience blockers, safetyism, and smartphones. Human beings are omnivores, requiring a diverse array of nutrients to build healthy physical bodies. A child fed exclusively on refined carbohydrates will survive but will suffer severe developmental deficits and malnutrition. Similarly, humans are socially omnivorous creatures. We require a vast and diverse diet of social friction, challenges, face-to-face interactions, and minor adversities to develop into functional, resilient adults. The modern culture of safetyism acts as a profound experience blocker. By seeking to eliminate all physical risks and emotional discomforts from childhood, adults systematically starve children of the essential social nutrients their developing brains require. We effectively banned the acute, necessary stressors that forge resilience. But the deterioration of adolescent mental health did not reach catastrophic levels simply because of overprotection. The crisis ignited when this physical restriction was paired with the introduction of a second, far more potent experience blocker, the smartphone. The smartphone functions much like the cuckoo bird. The cuckoo lays its egg in the nest of another species. Because the cuckoo hatches first and grows rapidly, it quickly pushes the native eggs out of the nest, monopolizing the mother's resources. When a smartphone is placed in the hands of a child, it aggressively pushes out nearly every other form of developmental experience. The device demands absolute attention, anchoring the child in a sedentary state while ignoring the physical world entirely. One might argue that the digital universe offers its own rich tapestry of experiences, from encyclopedic knowledge to global communities. But for a developing brain expecting the specific inputs of embodied, synchronous, real-world human interaction, these digital substitutes are profoundly inadequate. Text-based communication and carefully curated images completely bypass the neural circuits designed to interpret subtle vocal tones, shifting facial expressions, and the vital timing of physical conversation. If we wish to raise children capable of navigating the complexities of adult social life, we cannot allow their primary social education to occur in a disembodied digital expanse. We must remove these experience blockers and reconstruct a clear, stepped pathway toward maturity. Rites of passage. Across nearly all human cultures and historical eras, societies have utilized formal rites of passage to shepherd young people through the perilous transition of puberty. These communal rituals serve an essential psychological and sociological function. They officially strip away the identity of the dependent child and forge the identity of a responsible adult. Anthropological studies reveal that these rites almost universally follow a three-part structure. First comes the separation phase, where the adolescent is physically or symbolically removed from their parents' and childhood environment. Next is the transition phase, where community elders, not the parents, guide the youth through rigorous challenges, instruction, and sometimes physical ordeals. Finally, the reincorporation phase features a joyous communal celebration, welcoming the transformed individual back into society, now burdened with the expectations and privileges of adulthood. Historically, these rites were heavily gendered, reflecting the specific survival needs of the community. For girls, rituals often commenced with their first menstruation, focusing on the sacred transition into womanhood and fertility, such as the elaborate multi-day Apache sunrise dance. For boys, whose biological transition is less conspicuous, rites were often conducted in cohorts, forcing groups of young men to endure shared hardships to forge unbreakable bonds. In warrior cultures, this meant enduring pain to prove bravery. In other traditions, such as Judaism, a boy's bar mitzvah requires years of rigorous study, culminating in a daunting public demonstration of intellectual and spiritual maturity before the entire congregation. While modern secular societies have largely abandoned these formal, community-wide rituals, the psychological necessity for them remains embedded in the adolescent mind. When adults fail to provide structured rites of passage, youth inevitably invent their own. We see this in the dangerous hazing rituals of college fraternities, street gangs, and the psychological gauntlets of sororities. Young people are so desperate for a clear threshold to cross and for the binding solidarity of a peer group that they will willingly subject themselves to cruelty and humiliation to achieve it. Why do we block the transition to adulthood? For generations, the journey to adulthood in Western societies was marked by clear, age-based milestones. At 13, you might be allowed to navigate the city or see a PG-13 movie without an adult. 16 brought the monumental responsibility of a driver's license. 18 delivered legal adulthood, the right to vote, and the expectation to enter the workforce or higher education. The physical world respected the gradual accumulation of age and maturity. However, as the culture of parental fear accelerated in the 1990s, society began dismantling these real-world milestones. Data reveals a steady decline over the last 3 decades in the percentage of teenagers acquiring driver's licenses, working part-time jobs, or dating, the very activities that previously defined the transition to independence. We trapped adolescents in a prolonged state of childhood dependency. Simultaneously, we handed them the keys to a virtual universe where age is entirely irrelevant. The internet recognizes no developmental thresholds. A 10-year-old with a smartphone has the exact same unfettered access to global communication, extreme ideologies, and explicit adult content as a 30-year-old. The digital world stripped away the progressive ladder of maturity. We systematically overprotected our youth in the physical world, denying them the milestones of independence, while simultaneously exposing them to the boundless, unfiltered chaos of the virtual world without a single developmental guardrail, building a ladder from childhood to adulthood. While a diverse, modern society may never agree on a singular sacred rite of passage, we must urgently reconstruct a shared ladder of progressive independence. This requires re-establishing distinct, culturally recognized milestones tied to specific ages, granting predictable freedoms matched with clear responsibilities. We might begin at age 6, marking the end of early childhood by assigning formal household duties, signaling that the child is now a contributing member of the family unit, not merely a dependent. Age 8 could represent the dawn of local freedom, where children are permitted to roam their immediate neighborhoods and run minor errands unsupervised, perhaps equipped with a basic watch or tool for emergencies, but entirely free of smart devices. By age 10, this roaming distance should expand significantly, accompanied perhaps by a basic flip phone to coordinate logistics, but still strictly isolated from the internet. Age 12 should usher in an era of apprenticeship. Adolescents must begin looking beyond their parents for mentorship, taking on paid responsibilities for neighbors or the community, and spending extended periods away from the parental gaze. Age 14, aligning with the entry into high school, represents a massive leap in social and academic pressure. It is only at this stage, after years of developing real-world competence, that a child might be ready for the responsibility of a smartphone. Age 16 must be legally redefined as the threshold for internet adulthood. The tragic legislative error of the late 1990s, which set the age of digital consent at an unenforced 13, must be corrected. 16 should be the true gateway, the age at which a young adult is legally permitted to sign away their data and navigate the algorithmic pressures of social media, coinciding with the profound real-world responsibility of operating a motor vehicle. Finally, ages 18 and 21 would remain the ultimate markers of full legal and societal independence. In sum, the years of early puberty represent a fleeting critical window where the human brain is aggressively rewired based on the specific experiences it encounters. For healthy development, this experience-expectant brain requires the friction, risks, and synchronous interactions of the physical world. Instead, we have subjected a generation to two catastrophic experience blockers: a culture of safetyism that eradicated unstructured play, and the smartphone, which devoured their time and attention. By dismantling the traditional rites of passage and age-based milestones, we have left adolescents wandering aimlessly in a digital void. To rescue this generation, we must aggressively restrict their immersion in the virtual world while simultaneously forcing open the doors to the physical world, constructing a clear, demanding, and ultimately liberating ladder toward adulthood. Chapter 5. The 4 foundational harms: social deprivation, sleep deprivation, attention, fragmentation, and addiction. During a family vacation in 2016, a poignant moment occurred when my young daughter, engrossed in an interactive tablet game, called out and pleaded for me to take the device away from her. She confessed that she was trying to pull her eyes away from the screen, but simply could not. She was firmly in the grip of a behavioral mechanism known as a variable ratio reinforcement schedule, a psychological tool that stands as one of the most effective methods ever devised for capturing and controlling the actions of a living creature. Over a century ago, the pioneering psychologist Edward Thorndike placed hungry felines into puzzle boxes to study how they learned to escape. He discovered that the animals did not use logic to reason their way out. Rather, they stumbled upon the right maneuver, and the resulting reward stamped in the behavior. The repetition of an action leading to a reward was not a conscious decision, but rather the wearing smooth of a pathway within the brain. Whenever we witness a young person, or even ourselves, locked in a trance of repetitive swiping on a glass screen, we are witnessing those exact neurological pathways being worn relentlessly smooth. The great rewiring of the 2010s laid down millions of these behavioral pathways in the minds of Generation Z. As we transition into examining the specific consequences of this profound cultural shift, it is essential to map out the 4 distinct foundational harms that the phone-based childhood inflicted upon youth of all genders: the deprivation of genuine social interaction, the theft of restorative sleep, the shattering of focused attention, and the behavioral conditioning of addiction. The arrival of the phone-based childhood. When the original smartphone was unveiled to the public in 2007, it was heralded as a revolutionary, pocket-sized Swiss Army knife of utility, a convenient fusion of a music player, a mobile telephone, and an internet browser. In its earliest incarnation, the device was a tool designed to be utilized when a specific need arose and subsequently put away. However, the ecosystem shifted dramatically with the introduction of external software development kits, allowing thousands of third-party engineers to create and distribute applications directly to consumers. By the time the digital storefronts reached maturity, they housed millions of applications fiercely competing for human attention. The victors of this digital arms race were invariably those who adopted a free-to-use, advertisement-driven model. Because users would rarely pay outright for an application, companies were forced to generate revenue by capturing and holding the user's gaze for as long as humanly possible. Our versatile digital tools mutated into sophisticated platforms engineered to hijack human consciousness. The individuals most susceptible to this aggressive psychological manipulation were children and adolescents, whose prefrontal cortices, the brain regions responsible for impulse control and delaying gratification, were years away from maturity. While previous generations had been captivated by television, those screens remained anchored in living rooms. The smartphone, however, could be carried into the schoolyard, the classroom, and the bedroom. By 2015, the vast majority of teenagers carried a highly stimulating, attention-monopolizing portal in their pockets, permanently altering the texture of their daily lives. Social media and its transformations. To understand the severity of this shift, we must recognize that social media underwent a fundamental mutation around the year 2010. The earliest iterations of these networks, launched in the early 2000s, were true social networking systems designed to connect existing friends and facilitate communication. But at the dawn of the 2010s, the architects of these networks introduced mechanisms like the like button and the retweet or share function. These seemingly innocuous features suddenly quantified the success of every digital interaction. They transformed casual communication into a high-stakes public performance where social validation was measured in real-time metrics. Concurrently, platforms began utilizing algorithmic curation. Instead of displaying a chronological list of updates from friends, the systems deployed complex code to predict and display the content most likely to provoke an emotional reaction and keep the user scrolling. Coupled with the invention of push notifications, a mechanism that allowed the platform to vibrate the device and interrupt the user at any moment, the ecosystem was fully weaponized. Social networking systems meant to connect people morphed into social media platforms built for performative broadcasting. Adolescents were forced to navigate a toxic virtual environment where peer acceptance required constant brand management, forever chasing the elusive validation of unseen crowds. The opportunity cost of a phone-based childhood. Imagine being offered a novel device for your child that promises boundless entertainment, yet you are told it requires 50 hours of their week to operate. Any rational caregiver would instantly recognize the devastating opportunity cost of such an arrangement. In economics, the opportunity cost represents the total value of the alternative experiences lost when a particular path is chosen. As the philosopher Henry David Thoreau astutely observed, the true cost of a thing is the amount of life that must be exchanged for it. When surveys reveal that the average modern adolescent dedicates an astonishing 6 to 8 hours of their daily leisure time to screen-based activities, we must confront what is being sacrificed. While previous generations certainly spent hours watching television or playing early video games, the pervasive, omnipresent nature of the modern smartphone means that this digital consumption has infiltrated every crevice of waking life. A staggering proportion of modern teenagers report being online almost constantly, indicating an existence where they are rarely fully present in their physical surroundings. The cost of this digital immersion is the wholesale forfeiture of the vital, real-world experiences necessary to forge a healthy adult mind. Harm number 1. Social deprivation. The most immediate casualty of the phone-based childhood is the very social connection it purportedly enhances. Data tracking the daily habits of teenagers reveals a sharp, unprecedented collapse in the amount of time adolescents spend physically gathering with their peers outside of school. This decline began steadily, but accelerated violently as smartphone ownership saturated the youth population in the early 2010s. While teenagers might argue that they are simply socializing through digital text and video chats, psychological research paints a grim picture. Adolescents who dedicate the most hours to digital networking are significantly more likely to suffer from emotional desolation and profound loneliness, whereas those who engage in embodied, real-world group activities exhibit the most robust psychological health. This deprivation extends beyond the mere hours lost. Even when teenagers are physically in the same room, the presence of the smartphone fundamentally degrades the intimacy of their interaction. The subtle knowledge that a conversation partner might instantly shift their focus to a vibrating piece of glass sends a powerful, unspoken message. The digital ether is more important than the human being sitting across the table. This constant partial attention prevents the deep attunement and synchronous joy that human play and face-to-face dialogue provide. The Great Rewiring engineered a generation that is hyper-connected globally but tragically disconnected from the physical community surrounding them. Harm number 2. Sleep deprivation. The biological transition of puberty naturally alters an adolescent's circadian rhythm, prompting a desire to stay awake later into the night. Historically, this biological shift clashed with early school start times, leading to a chronic, low-level exhaustion among teenagers. However, the introduction of the smartphone weaponized this vulnerability. By 2013, as smartphones became the dominant fixture of adolescent bedrooms, the percentage of teenagers receiving severely inadequate sleep skyrocketed. The consequences of this deprivation are biologically and psychologically catastrophic. The developing adolescent brain requires massive amounts of restorative rest to consolidate learning, regulate emotions, and manage the aggressive neurological pruning of puberty. When an adolescent brings an endless feed of highly stimulating content, illuminated by circadian-disrupting blue light, into their bed, they actively sabotage their own neurological development. Exhausted teenagers exhibit impaired cognitive function, a diminished capacity to tolerate frustration, and a vastly heightened susceptibility to both anxiety and depressive spirals. The digital portal in their hands directly competes with the essential biological rest their bodies desperately require. Harm number 3. Attention fragmentation. The legendary American psychologist William James defined attention as the mind's ability to take possession of a single train of thought while actively withdrawing from competing stimuli. It is the disciplined choice to remain on one mental path. The modern smartphone is an engine designed specifically to obliterate this discipline. With notifications for social updates, breaking news, and direct messages firing constantly, the average teenager's phone demands their attention dozens, if not hundreds, of times a day. This relentless barrage mirrors a dystopian scenario where individuals are subjected to continuous cognitive disruption, preventing any sustained, deep reflection. Attempting to focus on academic studies or complex problem-solving while a device continuously offers the intoxicating off-ramp of social gossip or algorithmic entertainment is a battle the adolescent prefrontal cortex is ill-equipped to win. The continuous shifting of focus degrades working memory and leaves the young mind scattered, exhausted, and incapable of the deep, immersive contemplation required for profound intellectual and emotional growth. Harm number 4. Addiction. When the desire to check a device becomes an involuntary reflex, the user has crossed the threshold into behavioral addiction. The architects of modern digital platforms borrowed heavily from the science of behavioral conditioning, exploiting the vulnerabilities of the adolescent reward system. By offering unpredictable, variable rewards, a sudden influx of likes, a viral comment, a novel video, the platforms flood the developing brain with dopamine. Over time, the brain adapts to this artificial stimulation by down-regulating its own dopamine receptors, resulting in a state where ordinary real-world activities no longer feel pleasurable. When separated from their devices, addicted adolescents experience the universal symptoms of withdrawal: acute anxiety, profound irritability, insomnia, and a dark, generalized dysphoria. The smartphone acts as a conduit for continuous digital stimulation, leaving the user trapped in a cycle of craving and temporary relief. This state of digital dependency strips the child of their agency, transforming the vibrant exploration of youth into a hollow, compulsive loop of consumption. In sum, the transition from a childhood rooted in physical reality to one mediated by screens inflicted 4 foundational harms upon an entire generation. First, it triggered widespread social deprivation, pulling adolescents away from the synchronous, embodied play and face-to-face interaction required to build true community. Second, it caused an epidemic of sleep deprivation, robbing the developing brain of the rest essential for emotional regulation and cognitive growth. Third, it engineered a state of chronic attention fragmentation, conditioning the mind to seek constant interruption and rendering deep thought nearly impossible. Finally, the behavioral engineering of these platforms trapped millions of vulnerable youths in cycles of behavioral addiction, altering their reward pathways and leaving them perpetually anxious when disconnected. These 4 pillars of harm are the bedrock upon which the modern crisis of adolescent mental health was built. Chapter 6. Why social media harms girls more than boys. Born at the dawn of the new millennium, a young girl named Alexis received her first tablet computer at the tender age of 10. Initially, her digital explorations were innocent, confined to managing virtual stuffed animals. However, the social landscape of middle school swiftly encroached. Taunted for her childish digital play, she was pressured by peers to open an Instagram account. Despite her parents' stringent rules, screens were banished from bedrooms and iPad usage was meticulously monitored. Alexis, like countless adolescents, discovered paths around these guardrails. She falsified her age, downloaded the application in secret, and mastered the art of hiding it beneath innocuous icons on her screen so she would not have to continually delete it. When her parents eventually uncovered the account and attempted to impose boundaries, she simply created secondary, hidden profiles. Her initial foray into this virtual domain was marked by elation. An early journal entry celebrated the sheer thrill of acquiring over 100 followers. Yet this joy was remarkably short-lived. Within a mere 5 months, her emotional state plummeted, and she began to show severe signs of depression. The algorithmic feed, which had initially catered to her interest in fitness, rapidly mutated. It began force-feeding her a relentless stream of idealized models, transitioning into extreme dieting advice, and ultimately pulling her into the dark undertow of pro-anorexia content. By her 8th grade year, she was hospitalized, battling severe eating disorders and crushing depression, a struggle that would define the remainder of her teenage years. The magnetic pull of these platforms is undeniably powerful, and understanding how they capture and subsequently devastate young women is crucial. As the transition from basic mobile phones to sophisticated smartphones accelerated in the early 2010s, it ushered in a massive expansion in the volume and intensity of digital consumption. This era corresponded with a sudden, disproportionate influx of young girls into psychiatric wards across the English-speaking world. The evidence that social media harms girls. At their core, platforms like Instagram operate as engines for asynchronous, wide-scale distribution of user-generated material. Users broadcast curated fragments of their lives and then wait, often anxiously, for the judgments of an unseen audience. This cycle of posting, waiting, and relentlessly comparing oneself to others inflicts a heavier toll on young women than on young men. A vast body of correlational research consistently highlights this disparity. While some isolated studies have suggested the psychological impact of digital media is negligible, equating it to the effects of eating potatoes, closer scrutiny reveals a different reality. When researchers isolate the specific use of social media, rather than lumping it together with benign activities like watching television or using a computer, the correlation with mental distress in girls becomes undeniable and substantial. It is not akin to consuming root vegetables. It is statistically comparable to the risks associated with binge drinking. The data reveals a stark trajectory. The more hours a young woman dedicates to social media, the greater her likelihood of experiencing clinical depression. Those immersed in these platforms for 5 or more hours a day are 3 times as likely to be depressed as those who report no social media time. Is social media a cause or just a correlate? Skeptics often argue that these findings only prove a correlation. Perhaps, they suggest, there is a reverse correlation where depression drives young women to retreat into the virtual world rather than the virtual world causing the depression. To pass cause from effect, scientists rely on randomized controlled trials. These experiments frequently involve instructing cohorts of young adults to drastically reduce or entirely abstain from social media usage for a designated period. The results of these interventions are telling. When participants detach from these platforms, they consistently report significant reductions in feelings of profound isolation and depressive symptoms over a span of several weeks. Conversely, experiments that intentionally expose young women to manipulated, hyper-attractive selfies from platforms like Instagram demonstrably erode their body image in real time. Taken together, this experimental data confirms what the correlational studies suggest. Immersive social media use actively generates anxiety and depression. It is a primary driver, not merely a correlate. Does social media affect groups as well as individuals? A critical limitation of individual experiments is that they fail to capture the profound sociological shift that occurs when an entire generation adopts a new technology simultaneously. Social media does not merely affect the isolated consumer, it fundamentally rewires the culture of the collective. When these devices entered school hallways, they obliterated the interstitial moments of physical connection. Students ceased talking between classes. They stopped making eye contact. The shared laughter of the lunchroom was replaced by the silent, downward gaze of digital absorption. Consequently, even the rare student who abstained from social media suffered a degraded social environment. The group-level impacts of this technological saturation likely dwarf the individual effects measured in isolated lab settings. Historical data tracking the initial expansion of platforms like Facebook across university campuses or the arrival of high-speed internet in various regions reinforces this. As these digital pathways opened, utilization of mental health services surged, symptoms of poor mental health increased, and academic performance suffered, with the most pronounced damage occurring among young women. The collective migration of adolescent social life into the digital ether was not just a parallel event to the mental health crisis, it was the catalyst. Girls use social media more than boys. As smartphones became ubiquitous, the digital habits of the sexes diverged. Young men gravitated toward immersive multiplayer gaming, Reddit, and video streaming on YouTube. Young women, however, flocked to visually oriented platforms like Instagram, Snapchat, Pinterest, and Tumblr. These specific applications repeatedly rank as the most detrimental to adolescent well-being, exacerbating anxieties regarding body image and sleep deprivation. These platforms operate on a relentless business model designed to maximize user engagement and extract data for advertisers. The sheer volume of time consumed is staggering. By the mid-2010s, 1 in 7 American high school girls was dedicating upwards of 40 hours a week to these applications, the equivalent of a full-time job superimposed over their academic and developmental lives. Because young women spend vastly more time within these specific, highly toxic digital environments, the resulting surge in anxiety and depression is tragically predictable. Agency and communion. While the psychological profiles of young men and women share vast similarities, evolutionary and cultural forces produce distinct motivational leanings. Human drives can be broadly categorized into agency, the desire to assert one's individuality, demonstrate competence, and influence the world, and communion, the deep-seated need to forge empathetic bonds, care for others, and integrate into a broader social fabric. Historically, young men have skewed toward agency strivings, while young women lean heavily toward communion. For adolescents forging their identities, achieving a balance between individual distinction and social belonging is paramount. Social media masterfully exploits these innate drives. For young women, it presents a glittering mirage of absolute communion, offering frictionless pathways to connect. Yet, the architecture of these platforms ultimately subverts this very desire, replacing genuine bonds with superficial metrics. 4 reasons why girls are particularly vulnerable. The digital ecosystem preys upon the specific social orientations of young women through 4 distinct mechanisms, explaining the rapid and severe deterioration of their mental health following the smartphone revolution. Reason number 1. girls are more affected by visual social comparison and perfectionism. Human beings are, by nature, comparison machines. We possess an internal gauge, a sociometer, that constantly assesses our standing within our local prestige hierarchy. When our perceived status drops, it triggers an anxiety alarm. For adolescents navigating the physical and social turbulence of puberty, this gauge is hypersensitive. While all teenagers harbor insecurities about their appearance, the societal premium placed on female beauty elevates the stakes dramatically for young women. In the pre-digital era, girls compared themselves to airbrushed models in magazines, distant, unattainable figures who were not their direct peers. The smartphone shattered this boundary. Today, a young woman's feed is saturated with the meticulously curated, heavily edited highlight reels of her actual classmates and a global network of influencers. Advanced digital filters allow users to manipulate their features, erasing blemishes, enlarging eyes, and altering body shapes with a simple swipe. As these hyper-perfected images flood the network, the sociometers of ordinary girls inevitably plummet because the baseline of perceived average beauty has been artificially inflated. This constant visual barrage triggers a destructive cycle of socially prescribed perfectionism, the crushing belief that one must meet impossibly high standards dictated by an unseen audience. Unlike internal perfectionism, this external pressure breeds chronic anxiety, as every post carries the threat of public failure. Even when young women rationally understand that these images are digitally altered, the unconscious mechanisms of social comparison operate in milliseconds, overriding logical thought and leaving deep psychological scars. The algorithmic machinery of platforms like TikTok specifically targets and amplifies these insecurities, rapidly feeding young users a diet of content that glorifies extreme thinness and unrealistic beauty. Reason number 2. Girls' aggression is more relational. While young men historically express aggression through physical dominance or direct confrontation, female aggression frequently manifests relationally. Because communion and social bonds are so highly valued, the most devastating strike against a young woman is the sabotage of her relationships and her reputation. The digital age weaponized this form of indirect aggression. The face-to-face conflicts of the schoolyard have been replaced by the infinite reach of cyberbullying. Platforms facilitate the creation of anonymous accounts, exclusion from digital group chats, and the rapid dissemination of malicious rumors. The threat is inescapable. The bully now resides in the victim's pocket, vibrating in the sanctuary of her bedroom. Furthermore, the circulation of intimate photographs has become a brutal currency of social prestige among some adolescent boys, a currency extracted through coercion and blackmail, and paid for with the profound shame of young women. This constant threat of viral humiliation forces girls into a perpetual state of hyper-vigilant defense, acutely aware that any misstep can leave a permanent public mark. Reason number 3. Girls more easily share emotions and disorders. Emotions possess a contagious quality within social networks. Long before the internet, researchers observed that psychological states, both positive and negative, ripple through communities. Crucially, negative emotions like depression are significantly more transmissible than happiness, and this transmission occurs most powerfully among women who generally exhibit higher emotional expressivity. When the smartphone hyperconnected an entire generation of adolescent girls, it created the perfect conduit for mass emotional contagion. This phenomenon extends beyond simple shared sadness to encompass sociogenic illnesses, conditions generated and spread by social forces and shared beliefs rather than biological pathogens. Historically, these outbreaks disproportionately affected young women under stress. Today, platforms driven by algorithms and prestige bias amplify the most extreme expressions of suffering. Influencers who broadcast severe psychological symptoms accumulate massive followings, inadvertently training their audiences to mimic these behaviors. This digital contagion has fueled alarming spikes in self-diagnosed conditions, from tic disorders resembling Tourette's syndrome to severe dissociative states, rippling across the globe at the speed of a viral video. Reason number 4. Girls are more subject to predation and harassment. The architecture of the virtual world dismantled the traditional boundaries separating children from adult strangers. For young women, this translates into a dramatically elevated risk of sexual predation and harassment. Evolutionary psychology suggests that male mating strategies are more prone to coercion and the targeting of vulnerable youth. The internet provides a frictionless hunting ground where predators can easily mask their identities and access millions of minors. Young girls navigating these platforms are routinely subjected to unsolicited advances, explicit demands, and aggressive stalking from older men. This predatory environment, coupled with the internal school dynamics of coercion regarding intimate images, dictates that young women must navigate the digital world with an exhausting level of wariness. They are forced to operate chronically in defend mode, contributing significantly to the overarching tide of anxiety. Quantity over quality. The ultimate irony of the hyper-connected era is the profound loneliness it has engineered. As adolescents fractured their time across a multitude of digital platforms, servicing hundreds of superficial connections and maintaining arbitrary streaks of communication, the energy available for deep, sustaining relationships evaporated. For young women, the psychological bedrock of friendship relies on quality, not quantity. A single, deeply supportive bond provides more resilience than 1,000 digital followers. Yet the social media ecosystem prioritizes the relentless accumulation of shallow ties. By replacing intimate, face-to-face conversations with performative broadcasting, the digital age has left a generation of girls stranded in a crowded room, desperately starved for genuine human connection. In sum, the architecture of the phone-based childhood is inherently hostile to the psychological development of young women. The correlational data is stark. Heavy immersion in social media triples the likelihood of clinical depression. Experimental evidence solidifies this link, demonstrating that these platforms actively generate distress rather than merely reflecting it. The sociological rollout of these technologies fundamentally degraded the communal environment, harming even those who abstained. Young women are uniquely vulnerable to this specific digital ecosystem. They utilize visually intensive platforms at vastly higher rates than their male counterparts. Their profound evolutionary drive for social communion is hijacked by systems that weaponize visual comparison, amplify relational aggression, and facilitate the viral spread of emotional distress and sociogenic illness. Finally, the unpoliced nature of these platforms exposes them to unprecedented levels of predation and harassment. Social media is a brilliantly engineered trap. It lures young women with the promise of connection, only to drown them in a sea of transient high-stakes performances, ultimately stripping away the deep, real-world friendships necessary for navigating the perilous journey to adulthood. Chapter 7. What is happening to boys? There is a tragic transformation unfolding among many young men today, perfectly encapsulated by the story of a once vibrant child who lost himself to the digital void. In his early years, this boy was deeply engaged with the world, full of musical passions and grand dreams of visiting the home of his idol. Yet, a mere 6 years later, he had devolved into a fragmented shadow of his former self. His waking life became entirely mediated by screens, an endless, numbing rotation of social media messages, YouTube videos, and pornography. His capacity for sustained attention had been shattered. He could no longer hold a conversational thread without impulsively retreating to his device. He was operating at the frantic, superficial speed of the digital platforms that consumed him, effectively insulated from anything demanding stillness or serious contemplation. This is an extreme example, but it represents a widespread phenomenon. Countless young men share similar trajectories, having surrendered their formative years to the hypnotic pull of video games and easily accessible adult content. For many, this immersion began in elementary school and snowballed until it eclipsed essential real-world milestones: physical play with peers, adequate sleep, academic focus, and eventually romantic relationships. Some manage to emerge from this digital pit in early adulthood, often recognizing the profound sacrifices they made. They frequently express a deep sense of social deficit, feeling that their interpersonal skills are stunted, their general knowledge is lacking, and their connection to their own families was compromised by their virtual absenteeism. When analyzing the adolescent mental health crisis, it is tempting to focus primarily on young women, as their plunge into depression and anxiety in the early 2010s was remarkably steep and uniform across the English-speaking world. However, the data reveals a compelling, albeit more complex, crisis affecting boys. Since the early 2010s, rates of depression and anxiety among young men have also climbed steadily. Furthermore, the ultimate tragedy of youth suicide, which has always disproportionately affected males, has been rising at alarming rates. Unlike the sudden collapse of female mental health, which aligns perfectly with the explosion of smartphone and social media usage, the decline in male well-being traces a longer, more diffuse timeline. Boys began pulling away from real-world engagement long before the 2010s. The amount of time young men spent socializing face-to-face started to drop in the early 2000s, accelerating drastically alongside the adoption of smartphones. Similarly, a pervasive sense of hopelessness, the belief that they have little chance of a successful life, has been creeping upward among boys for decades, followed by a sharp spike during the Great Rewiring. To understand this crisis, we must examine the push and pull factors, the ways the physical world has become less hospitable to boys, and the ways the virtual world has perfectly engineered itself to capture them. The long decline of males. The struggles of young men are deeply rooted in profound structural and economic shifts that began in the latter half of the 20th century. The transition away from an industrial economy toward a service-oriented and knowledge-based landscape fundamentally altered the value of physical strength. Modern workplaces prize attributes such as the ability to sit still, maintain long-term focus, and communicate openly, skills that generally align more closely with female development. Consequently, women have made extraordinary and welcome strides in education and the workforce. However, as opportunities for women expanded, the trajectory for men began to stall and then reverse. By the late 20th century, female educational attainment began to surpass that of males across all levels. Today, boys consistently receive lower grades, exhibit higher rates of attention deficits and reading difficulties, and are significantly more likely to face school suspensions. This educational disparity is particularly acute among working-class and lower-income families. The decline of the modern male is not simply a mass psychological breakdown. It is deeply intertwined with these structural realities, including a notable decrease in the presence of positive male role models and involved fathers. Yet two critical psychological factors are often missing from this economic analysis. First, the culture of safetyism that arose in the late 20th century disproportionately restricted boys who possess a deep evolutionary drive for rough-and-tumble, risky physical play. Second, the advent of immersive online gaming and the omnipresent smartphone pulled boys decisively away from the physical world. It is the combination of this structural marginalization and the retreat into the virtual realm that has fueled a generation of floundering young men. Boys who fail to launch. The inability to transition smoothly into adulthood, often termed failure to launch, has become a defining characteristic of this crisis. A growing demographic of young men find themselves economically inactive, neither pursuing education nor seeking employment. They often remain in their childhood bedrooms indefinitely. This phenomenon mirrors the severe social withdrawal documented in Japan, known as the hikikomori. In response to intense societal pressures and a bleak economic outlook, many Japanese youths retreated into total isolation, relying on the internet to simulate the social and agency needs they could no longer meet in reality. While initially considered a culturally specific issue, this pattern of profound withdrawal is increasingly visible in Western nations. For a young man paralyzed by the uncertainties and risks of the physical world, a high-speed internet connection offers a seductive illusion of competence and connection, removing the motivation to forge a difficult path in reality. Boyhood without real-world risk. Imagine a childhood entirely sterilized of risk. A world without the adrenaline of climbing too high, the nervous anticipation of a physical confrontation, or the thrill of wandering out of an adult's sight. While this might sound like a parental utopia, it is an environment actively hostile to healthy male development. Historically, male and female adolescents exhibited distinct psychological profiles. Young women typically skewed toward internalizing disorders like depression, absorbing their distress. Young men, conversely, skewed toward externalizing behaviors, directing their distress outward through risky, often reckless actions. However, around 2010, this divergence began to collapse. Boys started exhibiting symptoms traditionally associated with girls, reporting intense internal distress while their externalizing behaviors plummeted. While it is undeniably positive that modern teenagers are engaging in fewer dangerous activities like drunk driving or physical violence, this rapid decline in risk-taking is deeply concerning. It suggests not a newfound wisdom, but a total withdrawal from physical reality. The data clearly shows that young men today are far less likely to seek out physical thrills or test themselves in the real world. Hospital admissions for unintentional injuries among young men, once a reliable indicator of healthy, albeit reckless, youthful exploration, have dropped significantly. Boys are simply not navigating the physical environments that historically taught them how to manage risk, conquer fear, and build resilience. The virtual world welcomes boys. As the physical world became heavily regulated and devoid of risk, the virtual world expanded to offer boundless, unsupervised frontiers. Early video games and home computers in the 1970s and 1980s disproportionately captivated boys. But it was the proliferation of high-speed broadband and sophisticated 3D graphics in the 1990s and 2000s that truly constructed an alternative universe. Massively multiplayer online games allowed boys to engage in complex simulations of exploration, competition, and combat. Crucially, as personal devices became ubiquitous, this gaming shifted from a shared social activity in the family living room to a solitary pursuit in the bedroom. Boys could now spend hours isolated in private spaces, interacting with shifting networks of global strangers. The virtual realm offered an endless supply of agency-building simulations, perfectly tailored to young male psychology, requiring none of the painful, real-world friction necessary for actual maturation. The virtual world consumes boys. The true crisis ignited when these immersive virtual experiences became portable. Before the smartphone, digital consumption was tethered to a desk or a console. The early 2010s placed a portal to infinite entertainment, gaming, and adult content directly into the pockets of adolescents, available constantly. As traditional avenues for male achievement narrowed and overprotective parenting restricted physical autonomy, the tech industry provided a frictionless substitute. Boys were offered powerful mechanisms to satisfy their innate drives for agency and mastery without ever having to leave their bedrooms. I will focus on two specific domains that have profoundly altered the trajectory of modern boyhood: pornography and video games. Pornography. The internet is arguably the most efficient distribution system ever created for hijacking the human sex drive. Evolution designed sexual desire to motivate individuals to undertake the daunting social risks of courtship and mating. In previous eras, accessing adult material was difficult and limited, meaning the primary path to sexual satisfaction required actual interpersonal engagement. The digital age obliterated this dynamic. High-speed internet flooded adolescent bedrooms with an infinite free supply of hardcore pornography. The rates of daily consumption among adolescent boys skyrocketed. This easy, frictionless access actively deters young men from navigating the complexities, uncertainties, and emotional vulnerabilities of real-world dating. Furthermore, heavy consumption rewires expectations, often diminishing a young man's capacity for genuine intimacy and leading to profound interpersonal dissatisfaction. By severing the evolutionary reward from the real-world effort required to achieve it, the digital ecosystem threatens to produce a generation of men fundamentally unequipped for real romantic partnerships. As artificial intelligence and virtual reality continue to advance, this retreat into digital simulation is likely to deepen. Video games. The impact of video games is more nuanced. Unlike pornography, the psychological community acknowledges that gaming can offer certain cognitive benefits, such as improved spatial reasoning and problem-solving skills. However, the core issue lies in the sheer volume of time consumed and the displacement of essential developmental experiences. While the majority of boys may play casually, a significant and concerning percentage fall into problematic or addictive usage patterns. These young men lose control, prioritizing virtual achievements over sleep, academic responsibilities, and physical health. The opportunity cost is massive. When a boy spends upwards of 40 hours a week locked in virtual combat, he forfeits the embodied, face-to-face interactions required to build true friendships. Furthermore, the social connections forged in multiplayer games are a poor substitute for real-world play. They lack the synchronous physical attunement that teaches empathy and conflict resolution. Virtual avatars cannot replicate the vital experience of reading facial expressions or navigating the physical rough-and-tumble play that builds male camaraderie. The friendships formed online are often transient and superficial, contributing to a profound friendship recession among modern men. As boys have migrated into these digital landscapes, they have gained a massive quantity of shallow connections at the tragic expense of deep, sustaining real-world bonds. All screens and no real-world play. The argument that online gaming fosters social interaction misses the fundamental nature of what children require. Video games are engineered to maximize engagement with the platform, not to teach the delicate art of human relationship maintenance. In the physical world, children must act as their own legislators and mediators, inventing rules and resolving disputes. The digital world automates all of this, stripping away the vital practice of self-governance. Moreover, virtual risks offer none of the anti-phobic benefits of physical danger. Simulating combat on a screen does not teach a young man how to manage his adrenaline, assess physical threats, or build actual courage. When digital simulation completely replaces real-world adventure, it inevitably produces young men who feel a deep, lingering sense of inadequacy. The data confirms this. Despite unprecedented digital connectivity, adolescent boys are reporting record levels of severe loneliness and isolation. Technology, freedom, and meaninglessness. We must ultimately ask why unrestricted access to infinite entertainment has yielded a generation plagued by despair. The answer lies in the sociological concept of anomie, a state of profound normlessness and disconnection. When individuals are untethered from stable communities and shared moral frameworks, they do not feel liberated. They feel lost. The Great Rewiring systematically uprooted young men from the physical communities that have grounded human development for millennia. Instead of growing up surrounded by known individuals who provide structure and accountability, modern boys are navigating a chaotic, transient digital ether. This environment offers no lasting roots and no clear pathway to honorable adulthood. It is a world of infinite choices and zero ultimate significance. This pervasive anomie explains the sharp, tragic rise in young men who report that their lives feel entirely meaningless. While boys and girls navigated the digital revolution through different applications and behaviors, the ultimate destination has been the same: a profound crisis of purpose, connection, and mental well-being. Chapter 8: Spiritual Elevation and Degradation. Reflecting not merely as a social scientist, but as a fellow human being, it feels as though a profound, unspoken shift occurred in the mid-2010s. The collective atmosphere transitioned from an open, exploratory mindset to a pervasive defensive posture. Understanding this transformation requires moving beyond traditional psychological terminology and embracing a concept often avoided in academic research: spirituality. The transition to a phone-based existence has inflicted a form of spiritual degradation that affects not just the youth but society at large. The concept of social space traditionally encompasses two dimensions: the horizontal axis of closeness versus distance among individuals, and the vertical axis of hierarchy and societal status. Yet, as articulated in ancient wisdom and historical philosophy, there exists a third, vital dimension: the axis of divinity or elevation. Actions of profound moral beauty, charity, and grace pull us upward along this axis, inspiring a desire to emulate such nobility. Conversely, acts of cruelty, pettiness, and moral deformity drag us downward, eliciting revulsion. This spiritual dimension exists independently of religious belief. It represents our human capacity to recognize and strive for the sacred, the pure, and the elevated. The critical question of our era is whether the ubiquitous phone-based life elevates us along this axis or degrades our collective spirit. Spiritual practices. While the scientific measurement of divine intervention remains elusive, psychological research confirms the profound benefits of spiritual practices. Activities such as meditation, communal prayer, and rituals of atonement significantly enhance human well-being by diminishing selfish focus and fostering a sense of connection to something greater than the individual. By examining 6 specific practices that historically bind communities and elevate the human spirit, we can vividly see what is sacrificed when lives become inextricably tethered to digital screens. Shared sacredness. Humanity operates on 2 distinct levels: the realm of the profane, consumed by everyday anxieties regarding wealth, status, and survival, and the realm of the sacred, where the ego recedes to merge with a collective purpose. Throughout history, societies have designed rituals, from congregational singing to the synchronized chants of a civil rights march, to lift individuals into this shared sacred space. This phenomenon generates a profound social electricity, forging bonds of trust and affection that sustain the community long after the ritual ends. To facilitate this elevation, traditions demarcate specific times, physical spaces, and objects as holy and separated from the mundane. However, the virtual ecosystem obliterates these boundaries. In the digital expanse, there is no shared calendar, no designated sanctuary, and no collective pause. Every moment is perpetually accessible, transforming all interaction into an undifferentiated, profane blur. Without the structuring of time and space for communal sacredness, individuals are left adrift in an isolating sea of transient, asynchronous connections, making them deeply vulnerable to the seductive, radicalizing narratives that prey upon a starved need for belonging. Embodiment. Rituals of elevation are fundamentally physical. Whether kneeling in prayer, swaying to a shared rhythm, or partaking in a communal feast, synchronous physical movement is a scientifically validated mechanism for dissolving the boundaries between individuals and fostering deep communal trust. The simple, ancient act of breaking bread from a shared table strengthens social bonds in ways that no disembodied interaction can replicate. The Great Rewiring systematically stripped physical movement and proximity from daily life, a deprivation dramatically accelerated by global pandemic lockdowns. When social existence is reduced to a screen, the neural circuits evolved to synchronize with others through shared motion remain dormant. To reclaim our spiritual health, we must actively seek out embodied, communal experiences, be it through live music, community sports, or shared physical rituals, recognizing that our physical presence is non-negotiable for true human connection. Stillness, silence, and focus. The human mind, when untrained, operates in a state of chaotic distraction. Ancient meditation traditions recognized this, offering practices of stillness and silence to cultivate a state of profound meditative absorption and mental unity. Monastic traditions worldwide isolate practitioners from the incessant noise of profane concerns to foster inner peace and shift the mind from a defensive posture to one of open discovery. The modern smartphone functions as an aggressive engine of distraction, engineered to shatter the very levees of mental unity that spiritual traditions seek to build. It floods consciousness with trivial alerts and fragments attention, making it nearly impossible to be fully present with others or to sit in peaceful solitude. Counteracting this degradation requires a deliberate rejection of constant stimulation, embracing silence, engaging deeply with nature without a device, and consciously practicing focused attention to calm the fractured modern mind. Transcending the self, true spiritual experiences, whether inspired by the vastness of nature, profound moral beauty, or deep meditative states, are characterized by a dissolution of the ego. Neurologically, this corresponds to the quieting of the brain's default mode network, the system responsible for our relentless self-referential thoughts and social anxieties. When this network is silenced, we perceive our profound interdependence within the broader tapestry of life. Social media platforms are the antithesis of self-transcendence. They are architectural monuments to the ego, demanding relentless self-promotion, comparison, and a hyper-vigilant curation of one's digital brand. They trap the mind in a perpetual state of profane self-obsession, rewarding materialism, vanity, and superficial metrics of prestige. By hooking adolescents during their most sensitive developmental windows, these platforms effectively block the path to self-transcendence, chaining an entire generation to the exhausting treadmill of the ego. Be slow to anger, quick to forgive. The wisdom of antiquity uniformly warns against the poison of hasty judgment and the corrosive nature of holding grudges. Moral philosophy teaches that the mind's automatic instinct is to judge rapidly and subsequently invent justifications for its prejudices. spiritual traditions urge a different path: to cultivate grace, to recognize our own profound flaws before condemning others, and to embrace the transformative, dispelling power of love and forgiveness. The digital ecosystem actively subverts this wisdom. It incentivizes rapid, merciless public condemnation, stripping context and humanity from those being judged. It demands unyielding ideological purity, punishing forgiveness as an act of treason. This architecture of outrage transforms the human mind into an engine of hostility, prioritizing the viral spread of cruelty over the difficult, elevating work of grace. Find awe in nature. The grandeur of the natural world has forever been a primary conduit for human spirituality. Awe, the sublime emotion triggered by encountering a vastness that transcends our existing mental frameworks, shrinks the ego, binds us to our communities, and imbues life with profound meaning. As an evolved biophilic species, we possess an innate drive to affiliate with the natural environments that sustained our ancestors. Yet, the phone-based childhood has systematically severed youth from the physical world. When modern adolescents do encounter natural beauty, the immediate impulse is not to absorb the transcendent moment but to capture, mediate, and broadcast it through a diminutive screen. While the internet can display images of the world's wonders, a disembodied, miniaturized representation consumed between bursts of digital outrage cannot replicate the soul-expanding awe of standing physically before the vastness of nature. The God-shaped whole. Philosophers have long posited that humanity possesses an innate, God-shaped whole, a deep, evolutionary yearning for connection to something ultimate, cohesive, and morally elevated. Whether this void is a product of evolutionary group dynamics or divine design, its reality is undeniable. When society fails to provide noble, elevating substance to fill this emptiness, it is rapidly filled with the toxic detritus of a hyper-connected, consumerist culture. The digital age has industrialized the pumping of this garbage, hijacking our consciousness with algorithmic precision. We are, ultimately, what we consume and contemplate. In sum, humanity navigates life not just horizontally across social distances, but vertically along an axis of spiritual elevation and degradation. The migration to a phone-based existence exerts a profound gravitational pull downward by systematically obstructing the ancient practices of shared sacredness, embodied connection, silent focus, ego transcendence, forgiveness, and the pursuit of natural awe. This digital rewiring degrades our collective spirit. It fosters an environment fundamentally incompatible with the behaviors that historically cultivate trust, meaning, and true communal belonging. Chapter 9. Preparing for collective action. When confronted with the sheer scale of the digital rewiring of youth, a pervasive sense of fatalism often sets in. A common refrain is that the ship has already sailed, or the train has left the station. The sight of preteens navigating the physical world with their heads bowed, eyes locked onto the glowing rectangles in their palms, has become so deeply normalized that reversing the trend feels like an impossibility. But this transportation metaphor is deeply flawed. When a commercial airliner is taxiing toward the runway and a critical safety malfunction is detected, the flight is aborted and the plane returns to the gate. Following the catastrophic sinking of the Titanic, maritime authorities did not simply accept that sinking ships were an inevitable consequence of modern travel. The vessel's sister ships were immediately pulled from service and structurally modified to prevent a recurrence. When a consumer product is found to be poisoning children, it is recalled. We are not helpless observers of a technological inevitability. A decade ago, the profound psychological and developmental hazards of a phone-based existence were largely obscured by the dazzling convenience of the technology. Today, those hazards are glaringly apparent. The crisis is not an insurmountable force of nature, it is a human-made architecture that we have the power to dismantle. However, it feels impossible because we are caught in a classic sociological trap. This trap is known as a collective action problem or a social dilemma. It occurs when individuals, acting rationally to protect their own immediate interests, make choices that ultimately degrade the well-being of the entire group. A classic example is overfishing in a shared pond. Each fisherman takes as much as he can to maximize his own survival, but in doing so, the fish population collapses and the entire community starves. Today, families find themselves caught in a digital equivalent of this dilemma. Consider a child arriving for the first days of middle school. She notices that several of her peers have acquired smartphones and are communicating through visually intensive social platforms. The social discourse of her peer group has migrated into a digital space to which she has no access. She begs her parents for a device, driven by the terrifying age-old adolescent fear of being ostracized. Her parents, who ideally wish to preserve her childhood and protect her from the known toxins of the virtual world, are faced with an agonizing choice. They must weigh the abstract future threat of digital addiction against the immediate, tangible pain of watching their daughter become a social pariah. Driven by love and the desire to protect her from immediate exclusion, they capitulate. They purchase the device. In doing so, they inadvertently tighten the snare for every other family in the community. As more children acquire these devices, the pressure on the remaining holdouts becomes unbearable. Eventually, the community reaches a stable, yet catastrophic equilibrium. Every child is tethered to a screen, the physical neighborhood is emptied of playing children, and the play-based childhood is extinguished. This identical trap ensnares the technology companies themselves. Driven by the relentless demands of the attention economy, platforms must acquire users as rapidly as possible to survive. Even if corporate policies or federal laws dictate a minimum age for users, any company that rigorously enforces these boundaries will inevitably lose its future market share to a less scrupulous competitor willing to look the other way. The result is a corporate race to the bottom, where the exploitation of underage users is quietly tolerated as a structural necessity for survival. Furthermore, this dynamic paralysis extends to the physical world, fueling the crisis of overprotective parenting. In an earlier era, sending a child out to play in the neighborhood was an effortless decision because the streets were filled with other children doing the exact same thing. But today, when neighborhoods are silent and empty, the parent who allows their child to walk to the local park alone becomes a scandalous outlier. They face the genuine risk of being judged by neighbors, or worse, having well-meaning but misguided bystanders involve law enforcement or child welfare agencies. To avoid the stigma of being labeled neglectful, parents surrender to the prevailing culture of hypervigilance, confining their children indoors and further depriving them of the physical autonomy their developing brains require. Escaping a trap of this magnitude requires recognizing that individual, isolated resistance is brutally difficult. The solution lies in collective response, which generally takes 4 distinct forms. The first mechanism is voluntary coordination. Just as the capitulation of one parent increases the pressure on all others, the steadfast resistance of a unified group provides mutual shelter. When parents form explicit pacts to delay the introduction of smartphones until a later developmental stage, they fundamentally alter the social math. If a child knows that a substantial cohort of her peers is also navigating middle school without a smart device, the threat of social exile evaporates. The trap shatters because the community creates a parallel, device-free ecosystem where children can safely mature. The second mechanism involves the deliberate shifting of social norms and the remoralization of behavior. Society possesses a profound capacity to change its collective mind about what is acceptable. We successfully stigmatize the act of driving under the influence of alcohol, transforming it from a regrettable mistake into a profound moral failing. We must now apply this same cultural pressure to reverse the stigmatization of childhood independence. The sight of an unaccompanied 10-year-old navigating a sidewalk or playing in a park must be restored to its rightful status as a symbol of healthy, successful parenting, rather than an invitation for public panic and state intervention. The third mechanism relies on technological solutions to alter the landscape of incentives. Innovation can be harnessed to counteract the very problems it created. The development of sophisticated, lockable pouches for devices in educational settings, the creation of robust, frictionless age verification software, and the popularization of modern, highly functional, dumb phones can provide families and institutions with the practical tools necessary to enforce boundaries without demanding superhuman willpower from either the adult or the child. The final mechanism is the deployment of institutional rules and legislative action. When voluntary coordination is insufficient, the architecture of the state and local institutions must intervene to break the deadlock. Schools must enact and rigorously enforce comprehensive device bans during the academic day. Governments must establish and defend firm legal boundaries regarding the age of internet adulthood. holding corporations accountable for the exploitation of minors. Simultaneously, legal frameworks surrounding child neglect must be clarified to explicitly protect parents who grant their children reasonable, age-appropriate independence. To navigate this complex terrain of institutional and parental reform, it is necessary to draw upon the expertise of those who have spent decades fighting for the restoration of a free, unsupervised childhood. The movement to reclaim the physical autonomy of youth has laid the vital groundwork for understanding how we might simultaneously delay their immersion in the digital ether. As we prepare to examine the specific actionable steps that can be taken by governments, technology architectures, educational institutions, and individual families, a profound caveat must be maintained. While the overarching principles of restoring physical play and delaying virtual immersion apply to the generation as a whole, the specific application of these principles will always require the nuanced judgment of those who know the child best. Every community possesses its own unique topography, and every child develops along a deeply individualized timeline. The goal is not to impose a rigid, uncompromising dogma upon every household, but to provide a shared blueprint for collective liberation. By moving together, we reduce the friction of resistance and forge a clear pathway back to a vibrant, embodied childhood. Chapter 10. What governments and tech companies can do now. Reflecting on the creation of the earliest and most dominant social media networks, one of the original architects of these platforms explicitly admitted that the foundational goal was to consume as much of human consciousness and time as physically possible. The strategy relied on engineering a continuous cycle of social validation, exploiting a deeply ingrained vulnerability in human psychology. By providing intermittent, unpredictable bursts of dopamine, a notification here, a like there, the platform successfully conditioned users to continually return and contribute more material. The pioneers of these systems understood exactly what they were doing. They knowingly manipulated the neurological reward pathways of their users, openly wondering what these unprecedented psychological experiments would ultimately do to the developing minds of children. The primary consumer is not actually the customer in the modern digital ecosystem. When an internet service is provided entirely for free, the user is the product being sold to advertisers. This economic reality means that the platforms are fundamentally incentivized to maximize the hours users spend staring at their screens, even if that means actively harming them in the process. Just as societies successfully regulated the food industry during the Progressive Era and mandated automotive safety features in the mid-20th century to reduce child mortality, the time has come to radically alter the incentives driving the technology sector. The race to the bottom of the brainstem. A former ethicist at Google powerfully articulated the destructive nature of the digital attention economy. He noted that the environment is defined by a ruthless, zero-sum competition for a finite resource, human focus. Because the advertising-driven business model demands endless growth, companies are locked in a devastating race to the bottom of the brainstem. If one corporation refuses to exploit a psychological vulnerability to capture attention, it will simply lose market share to a competitor who has no such moral qualms. This race begins with simple conditioning mechanics, such as the pull-to-refresh motion that perfectly mimics the addictive unpredictability of a slot machine. It progresses to the removal of natural stopping cues, replacing them with infinite scrolling feeds that cause the user to lose track of time entirely. When those tactics lose their potency, the platforms dig deeper into the human psyche, weaponizing the deep-seated adolescent need for social validation. By attaching numerical metrics to personal identity, counting followers and displaying public endorsements, technology conglomerates have successfully addicted an entire generation to the relentless pursuit of peer approval. To survive in this ecosystem, digital platforms are driven by three relentless imperatives. First, they must continually acquire new users. For social media networks, this often means turning a blind eye to the millions of underage children signing up for their services. While company policies and federal laws theoretically set the minimum age at 13, platforms actively resist implementing robust age verification methods. They know that children are the most valuable demographic. Capturing them early establishes lifelong behavioral habits. Thus, companies engage in a desperate race to capture ever younger demographics, terrified that losing the preteen market will spell long-term corporate doom. Second, platforms must maximize the time users spend actively engaged with the application. To accomplish this, they deploy sophisticated artificial intelligence algorithms that monitor every micro-hesitation and lingering glance. The system learns precisely what captures a young user's attention, regardless of how inappropriate, extreme, or psychologically damaging the content might be, and relentlessly serves them more of it. Friction is systematically eradicated. Auto-playing videos and endless feeds guarantee that consumption becomes a hypnotic, automatic reflex rather than a conscious choice. Third, the platforms must incentivize the continuous creation of new content. They exploit the acute adolescent sensitivity to social status by gamifying interactions. Features that reward users for maintaining daily communication streaks force children to prioritize the digital maintenance of network ties over the organic development of real-world relationships. Defaulting user profiles to public settings ensures that the intimate moments of adolescence are broadcast to the widest possible audience, maximizing the platform's inventory of searchable material. What governments and tech companies can do to end the race to the bottom of the brainstem? While one might hope that the technology industry would self-regulate, the structural incentives of the market render this nearly impossible. Meaningful change requires legislative intervention to reshape the landscape in 4 crucial ways. Assert a duty of care. The British government established a profound precedent in 2020 by enacting a design code that legally mandated technology companies to consider the best interests of children under 18. This framework asserted a fundamental moral and legal duty of care. Instead of demanding that children navigate complex settings to protect themselves, the law required platforms to establish maximum privacy settings as the default for minors. Furthermore, it demanded that geolocation tracking be disabled by default and that all privacy policies be transparent and easily comprehensible to a child. The ripple effects of this legislation have been global, inspiring similar efforts in various American states and federal proposals. Crucially, these regulations focus on the architecture and design of the platforms rather than the specific content of the speech, thereby sidestepping the treacherous waters of political censorship while neutralizing the specific mechanisms that cause the most harm. Raise the age of Internet adulthood to 16. The current legal threshold for Internet adulthood in the United States was established in 1998 as a hasty political compromise. Setting the age at 13 had absolutely no basis in developmental psychology or neurological maturity. It sent a disastrous cultural signal that early adolescence is an appropriate time for children to sign binding contracts, surrender their personal data, and subject themselves to the algorithmic manipulation of trillion-dollar corporations. The law must be updated to reflect reality. While 16-year-olds are not fully mature adults, their frontal cortices are significantly more developed than those of preteens. Raising the age of digital consent to 16, and strictly enforcing it, would protect youth during the most acutely vulnerable years of early puberty, allowing them to forge their identities in the physical world before entering the algorithmic crucible. Facilitate age verification. The demand for age verification often provokes valid concerns regarding privacy and the requirement to submit government-issued identification to private corporations. However, the technology for verification has evolved far beyond the simple uploading of a driver's license. Advanced cryptographic tokens and biometric networks can authenticate age without compromising anonymity or storing exploitable personal data. Even more practically, the technology giants that design the operating systems for nearly all modern devices, Apple, Google, and Microsoft, could easily integrate a universal age check feature. When a parent establishes a device for a minor, this setting would be activated by default. When the child attempts to access an age-restricted platform, the application would seamlessly query the device's operating system to confirm developmental eligibility. This solution places no burden on adult users, eliminates profound privacy risks, and empowers parents to effectively enforce boundaries without engaging in an unwinnable technological arms race against their own children. Encourage phone-free schools. The educational environment must be reclaimed from the digital ether. Governments at the local, state, and federal levels can actively accelerate this transition by subsidizing the relatively minor costs associated with acquiring lockable pouches or dedicated phone lockers for educational institutions. By removing the financial barriers to implementation, lawmakers can empower schools to banish personal devices entirely during the academic day, restoring the focus and social cohesion necessary for effective learning. What governments can do to incentivize more and better real-world experience? Simultaneously, the physical world must be rendered hospitable to childhood independence once more. In recent decades, a culture of intense paranoia has occasionally weaponized the legal system against parents who attempt to grant their children healthy autonomy. Stop punishing parents for giving children real-world freedom. Across the nation, parents have been subjected to grueling police investigations and threats of incarceration simply for allowing a child to play unattended in a local park or walk to a neighborhood store. The definition of child neglect has suffered massive concept creep, expanding from genuine, willful endangerment to encompass any moment a child is left unsupervised by an adult. This aggressive overreach actively criminalizes the exact play-based independence that builds resilience. Legislatures must enact clear, unambiguous laws protecting reasonable childhood independence. These statutes must redefine neglect strictly as the reckless disregard for an obvious, severe danger, ensuring that parents are legally protected when they make rational choices to foster their children's self-reliance. Encourage more play in schools. The relentless pursuit of standardized academic achievement has systematically starved children of vital, unstructured playtime. Educational authorities and state governments must recognize the overwhelming evidence that free play and extended recess are not mere luxuries but cognitive necessities. Mandates should be established to ensure that schools provide ample daily opportunities for unstructured play, particularly before and after the formal academic day, allowing children the space to negotiate their own social environments. Design and zone public space with children in mind. The physical architecture of modern communities often prioritizes the efficient movement of automobiles over the developmental needs of youth. When neighborhoods lack accessible sidewalks, crosswalks, or mixed-use zoning, children are effectively trapped indoors. Urban planning must intentionally reincorporate youth into the public square. This involves decentralizing play areas so they can be reached safely on foot or by bicycle. Furthermore, municipalities can temporarily close streets adjacent to schools during arrival and dismissal, transforming hazardous, congested thoroughfares into vibrant, spontaneous community gathering spaces. Making the process for obtaining block party permits effortless would further encourage the organic revitalization of physical neighborhoods. More vocational education, apprenticeships, and youth development programs. The intense homogenization of the educational system, prioritizing a strictly academic pathway to university, has alienated a substantial portion of the youth population, particularly young men. Governments must actively reinvest in career and technical education, providing rigorous, hands-on training in trades and applied sciences. Subsidizing apprenticeships allows young people to transition smoothly into the workforce while providing companies the incentive to mentor inexperienced youth. Additionally, state-sponsored gap year initiatives, service programs, and wilderness expeditions offer vital alternatives for adolescents to build anti-fragility, discover their passions, and contribute meaningfully to society outside the traditional classroom structure. In sum, the architecture of the modern childhood has been dictated by a disastrous combination of legislative failure and corporate exploitation. To rectify the severe underprotection of youth in the virtual world, national governments must establish a profound duty of care, forcing technology companies to prioritize the developmental safety of minors over the extraction of their attention. The legal age of internet adulthood must be elevated to 16, backed by frictionless, privacy-respecting age verification technologies integrated directly into device operating systems. Simultaneously, the profound overprotection of youth in the physical world must be dismantled. State and local authorities must refine neglect laws to protect parents who foster childhood independence, mandate extensive free play within the educational system, redesign public spaces to be accessible to the young, and vastly expand vocational and experiential learning opportunities. Only through coordinated, systemic action can the balance of childhood be restored. Chapter 11. What schools can do now. When faced with the overwhelming tide of adolescent anxiety and depression, educational institutions often respond with a desperate barrage of interventions. Consider a rural school that recently attempted to combat the psychological crisis by deploying every available modern resource. They hired additional therapists, implemented comprehensive social-emotional learning curricula designed to explicitly teach empathy and decision-making, and even brought in therapeutic animals for trauma-sensitive experiential learning. While well-intentioned, these efforts resemble a profound misdirection of energy, akin to standing upon the back of a whale while casting a net for minnows. The most monumental and effective solutions require no new curricula or expensive psychological interventions. They demand only that schools utilize the environments they already control to implement two massive systemic shifts: the total eradication of smartphones during the school day and the aggressive restoration of unstructured free play. Phone-free schools. The transformative power of removing digital devices from the educational environment is perfectly illustrated by the trajectory of a middle school in Colorado. Operating in a region plagued by tragically high rates of teen suicide, the school's leadership confronted a student body paralyzed by cyberbullying, sleep deprivation, and the relentless exhaustion of digital social comparison. In response, the administration instituted a comprehensive, unyielding ban on cellular devices. Phones were not merely silenced, they were banished to backpacks for the entirety of the school day, backed by strict, escalating consequences for any violation. The resulting metamorphosis was profound. The eerie, zombie-like silence of hallways filled with hunched, scrolling teenagers evaporated. In its place, the natural, boisterous sounds of human connection returned. Students began speaking to one another and engaging with their teachers. Academic performance soared, eventually earning the school the highest educational rating in the state. As the students themselves reported, once the physical temptation of the device was removed from their immediate environment, the digital world faded from their consciousness, allowing them to anchor their attention firmly in the present reality. By severing the digital tether, the school effectively neutralized the primary drivers of the modern childhood crisis: attention fragmentation, social deprivation, and behavioral addiction. It is crucial to differentiate a genuine phone-free environment from the superficial bans currently claimed by the vast majority of public schools. Merely forbidding the use of phones during instructional time is a hollow gesture. It forces students to covertly monitor their glowing screens beneath their desks, fracturing their focus while transforming educators into exhausted wardens policing a digital contraband. Furthermore, the moment the bell rings, these students immediately retreat into their virtual silos, ignoring the physical peers standing right beside them. To reclaim the educational environment, schools must go entirely phone-free from the moment of arrival to the final dismissal. This requires the use of lockable pouches or dedicated device lockers. While some parents express anxiety over losing instantaneous communication with their children, particularly in an era shadowed by the fear of school violence, security experts consistently note that a panicked student body furiously texting during a crisis creates a far more dangerous, chaotic environment than one where students are alert, present, and listening to adult instruction. The necessity of this physical separation is increasingly recognized by global authorities. International educational organizations have issued stark warnings regarding the severe disruption digital technologies inflict upon the learning environment, noting a clear association between mobile device usage and plummeting academic performance. This global decline in educational proficiency perfectly mirrors the historical timeline of the smartphone's proliferation. While the internet remains a miraculous tool for research and specialized learning, the personal smartphone is an engine of perpetual distraction. An institution cannot genuinely claim to prioritize the mental health and communal belonging of its students if it forces them to compete for attention against the hyper-addictive algorithms of the global internet. Playful schools. The second monumental shift requires addressing the profound fragility that now characterizes so many young students. A South Carolina educator, bewildered by the lack of resilience, interpersonal skills, and emotional regulation among his fourth graders, discovered a remarkably simple antidote: the restoration of play. With the support of his administration, he dramatically expanded recess, opened the playground before the morning bell, and instituted an after-school play club. This club operated under a radically different philosophy than modern, hyper-supervised athletics. It was a zone entirely devoid of screens and nearly devoid of adult interference. Provided with miscellaneous equipment and mixed-age peers, the children were granted absolute autonomy, governed only by the rules of basic physical safety. The adults present functioned merely as lifeguards, refusing to organize games or adjudicate minor disputes. Within a single semester, the school's culture underwent a seismic shift. Truancy plummeted, behavioral infractions on school buses vanished, and the volume of disciplinary referrals sent to the principal's office dropped by staggering margins. The students became visibly happier, kinder, and profoundly more capable of managing their own social dynamics. This environment of unstructured play attacks the root causes of childhood anxiety by forcing children to navigate their own social ecosystems. While well-meaning schools spend millions on formal social-emotional curricula attempting to lecture children on how to behave, free play is nature's original, flawlessly designed classroom. It organically teaches empathy, compromise, innovation, and frustration tolerance because the children are intrinsically motivated to master these skills simply to keep the game going. A school that combines a phone-free environment with a playful culture is administering the ultimate preventative medicine, breaking the grip of the virtual world while repairing the developmental deficits caused by real-world overprotection. The Let Grow Project. The culture of safetyism has severely stunted the real-world competence of modern youth. It is now alarmingly common to encounter adolescents who have never been permitted to walk around their own block, run a simple errand, or even utilize basic kitchen utensils. This suffocating level of adult supervision breeds a double helix of paralyzing doubt. Parents do not trust their children to navigate the world, and children, sensing this lack of faith, become terrified of the world. Life becomes a minefield of potential humiliation, leaving young people feeling utterly incapable of independent survival. To shatter this cycle of anxiety, educational institutions must actively push families to grant autonomy. One highly effective intervention tasks students with a specific mandatory homework assignment. They must go home and do something novel, challenging, and entirely unsupervised by an adult. Whether it is preparing a meal from scratch, navigating public transit, or simply walking to a local store alone, the objective is to force an encounter with real-world friction. When young people complete these tasks, the psychological transformation is immediate. Overcoming the initial fear of failure and successfully executing an independent action provides a profound surge of self-efficacy. More importantly, it shifts their internal identity. Instead of feeling like fragile dependents requiring constant surveillance, they realize they are capable contributors. They transition from feeling needy to feeling needed. Because it is nearly impossible for isolated parents to break the cultural norms of overprotection on their own, the school's mandate provides the necessary social cover, normalizing childhood independence across the entire community. Better recess and playgrounds. To truly harness the developmental power of play, schools must radically overhaul their approach to recess by expanding its duration, redesigning its physical spaces, and stripping away its suffocating regulations. The systematic starvation of playtime in American schools began decades ago, driven by a panicked obsession with standardized testing. In a misguided attempt to increase academic rigor, schools cannibalized recess, physical education, and the arts. Yet, this relentless academic pressure fundamentally violates the biological realities of child development. Depriving children of physical play does not increase their intellectual capacity. It destroys their focus, spikes their anxiety, and ultimately degrades their cognitive performance. The first necessary correction is the immediate expansion of recess, ensuring generous outdoor time throughout elementary and middle school, and entirely uncoupling it from disciplinary withholding. The students who struggle most with classroom behavior are precisely the ones who most desperately require physical release. Secondly, the physical architecture of the modern playground must be reimagined. The sterile, ultra-safe asphalt and plastic structures prevalent today offer almost no opportunity for creative problem-solving or the calibration of physical risk. True developmental growth thrives in adventure playgrounds, spaces filled with loose parts, tires, heavy wooden boards, sandbags, and building materials. These environments force children to collaborate, lifting heavy objects and constructing their own realities, seamlessly blending physical exertion with intense social cooperation. Furthermore, incorporating natural elements like water, stone, and untamed vegetation taps into the deep evolutionary human affinity for the natural world, relieving cognitive overload and drastically reducing stress. Finally, schools must radically reduce the rules governing play. The modern instinct to micromanage every playground interaction, dictating exactly how a game of tag must be played or requiring an adult referee for a football game, actively robs children of the opportunity to practice self-governance. When a pioneering primary school in New Zealand famously abolished all playground rules, allowing children to climb trees, ride bikes, and engage in rough-and-tumble play, the results defied the anxieties of modern parenting. Instead of chaos and catastrophe, incidents of bullying, vandalism, and severe injury actually declined. When children are granted genuine responsibility for their own physical safety and social harmony, they rise to the occasion, learning to navigate risk with brilliant, anti-fragile competence. Re-engage boys. The modern educational framework is increasingly hostile to the developmental needs of young men, contributing heavily to their tragic disengagement from the real world. As the traditional avenues for physical and vocational achievement have been dismantled, boys are falling precipitously behind in academic milestones, graduation rates, and eventual college completion. Finding no fulfillment in the rigid, sedentary structure of the modern classroom, they are easily lured into the frictionless, hyper-stimulating voids of the virtual world. Reversing this exodus requires a deliberate reinvestment in career and technical education. Providing rigorous, hands-on training in trades and applied sciences offers young men a tangible pathway to competence and economic stability, bypassing the narrow, often alienating pipeline of traditional collegiate academia. Equally vital is the urgent need to address the severe gender imbalance within the teaching profession. The precipitous decline of male educators, particularly in early childhood and elementary environments, deprives young boys of essential real-world role models. When boys look at the educational system and see an environment entirely coded as female, they struggle to envision a place for themselves within it, or within the rapidly expanding economic sectors of health, education, and literacy. Without positive, embodied male mentorship in their physical communities, boys will inevitably seek guidance from the digital ether, where algorithmic rabbit holes offer highly distorted, often radicalized visions of masculinity. The education experiment we most need. The tidal wave of mental illness currently overwhelming high schools and universities is not generated within those institutions. It arrives fully formed from the lower grades. By the time modern adolescents enter high school, their attention spans have already been shattered by years of digital immersion, and their psychological resilience has already been stunted by a decade of overprotection. To definitively prove the necessity of a radical course correction, society requires a massive, coordinated educational experiment. Entire districts or states must commit to randomly assigning their elementary and middle schools into distinct cohorts, some implementing strict all-day phone bans, others aggressively expanding unstructured free play and autonomous projects, others combining both interventions, and a final group maintaining the current, deteriorating status quo. Within a remarkably short window, the data would inevitably reveal the profound, emergent benefits of returning childhood to its natural state. We have the power to stem the flow of anxiety and despair at its source, but it requires the courage to dismantle the digital and bureaucratic cages we have built around our youth. In sum, the escalating psychological suffering within the educational system demands an immediate and profound structural response. Attempting to solve this crisis with piecemeal therapeutic additions while ignoring the fundamental architecture of the school day is an exercise in futility. The most powerful, cost-effective solutions lie in reclaiming the environment. First, the complete removal of personal digital devices during the school day is non-negotiable. Superficial classroom bans merely drive the addiction underground. True liberation requires physical separation, allowing students to completely detach from the algorithmic pressures of the virtual world and re-engage with their physical peers. Second, the educational system must aggressively reincorporate unstructured, risk-tolerant play. By extending recess, transforming sterile playgrounds into dynamic, nature-rich environments filled with manipulatable materials, and stepping back from the suffocating micromanagement of student interactions, schools can provide the exact environment the human brain requires to develop resilience and social mastery. Complementing this is the necessity of pushing children toward real-world autonomy. Educational mandates that require students to undertake independent, unsupervised tasks in their communities not only build unshakable self-confidence within the child, but also provide parents with the communal support necessary to abandon the exhausting practices of fearful, intensive parenting. Finally, the system must actively reform its structures to re-engage the massive demographic of young men who are currently withdrawing into the digital void. Expanding vocational training and actively recruiting male mentors are essential steps in providing boys with a meaningful, embodied path to adult competence. By executing these foundational shifts, eradicating the digital distraction and restoring the chaotic, brilliant necessity of physical play, schools can cease manufacturing fragility and once again cultivate a generation capable of thriving in the real world. Chapter 12. What Parents Can Do Now. In her insightful exploration of child-rearing, the developmental psychologist Alison Gopnik highlights a fascinating linguistic shift. The term parenting scarcely existed before the mid-20th century and only gained cultural traction in the 1970s. Historically, children matured within communities where caregiving was a shared, observable reality, eliminating the need for specialized parenting experts. However, as family structures shrank and adults devoted more hours to work, a new, intense approach emerged. Parents began adopting a mindset similar to a carpenter, viewing their child as a project requiring precise materials, expert guidance, and meticulous assembly to produce a flawless final product. Gopnik argues that this carpenter mentality is fundamentally flawed when applied to human development. Instead, she proposes the metaphor of a gardener. A gardener does not construct a plant. Rather, they cultivate a rich, protected ecosystem, providing the necessary soil and water, and then allowing the plants to grow organically in unpredictable, often wondrous ways. The central argument of this book has been that modern society has adopted a suffocating carpenter mentality in the physical world, vastly overprotecting youth and denying them the friction necessary for growth. Simultaneously, we have entirely abandoned the garden in the virtual world, leaving it unweeded and unprotected, allowing algorithmic forces to overrun our children's development. The result is a generation starving for rooted real-world community. To reverse this, we must become intentional gardeners in both realms. What follows is a blueprint for cultivating healthier childhoods, structured by developmental stages. For parents of young children, ages 0 to 5, during these foundational years, the primary developmental tasks involve mastering basic perceptual, cognitive, and motor skills. The human brain expects to wire itself through interactions in a three-dimensional, sensory-rich environment. So long as a child receives adequate nutrition, safety, and the love of attentive adults, the environment is good enough. The pressure to optimize every moment of a toddler's life is misplaced. What they truly require is abundant time to interact with their surroundings and the people within them. More and better experience in the real world. The biological imperative of the mammalian attachment system dictates that children need a secure base, a reliable caregiver who provides comfort. However, the ultimate purpose of this secure base is to facilitate exploration. The most profound learning occurs during off-base adventures, particularly through unstructured free play with peers. When this play involves children of mixed ages, the benefits multiply, as younger children naturally stretch their abilities to mimic older peers, while older children practice empathy and leadership. Therefore, the most critical provision for young children is abundant, age-diverse playtime. Parents need not view every interaction as an educational opportunity. Raising a child is a relationship, not a seminar. However, parental behavior serves as a powerful model. Adults must be highly conscious of their own digital habits, avoiding the trap of continuous partial attention where a screen constantly competes with the child for the parent's gaze. Furthermore, adults should encourage the innate desire of toddlers to contribute. Even at 2 or 3 years old, children can assist with simple household tasks. Entrusting them with these responsibilities integrates them into the family fabric and actively guards against the pervasive feelings of uselessness that plague so many modern adolescents. Less and better experience on screens. The intense, rapid-fire sensory stimulation delivered by modern screens is fundamentally mismatched with the developmental needs of young children. Digital devices promote passive consumption rather than active embodied exploration, which can significantly delay cognitive and motor learning. Consequently, medical authorities universally recommend keeping screens out of the daily lives of infants and toddlers. The young brain is desperate to map a physical reality, not a flat, glowing rectangle. There is, however, one notable exception: synchronous, interactive video communication with distant family members or friends. Research indicates that live video chats can genuinely foster emotional bonding and language acquisition, whereas passive consumption of pre-recorded videos offers negligible benefits and can even disrupt linguistic development in children under 2. Following the consensus of pediatric experts, screens should be avoided entirely before 18 months, save for video chatting. As children approach the preschool years, exposure should remain highly limited, focused strictly on high-quality, co-viewed educational content. Crucially, devices must never be used as digital pacifiers to silence tantrums, and they must be banished from bedrooms long before sleep to protect the vital restorative rest that young brains require. For parents of children, ages 6 to 13, elementary and middle school. As children transition into formal schooling, their developmental focus shifts outward. They begin to navigate complex social hierarchies, becoming acutely aware of peer judgment. This era is characterized by the aggressive activation of conformist and prestige biases, the innate drives to copy the majority and emulate those with high social status. Because children are so ravenous for social learning during these sensitive periods, parents must be highly intentional about the environments and role models their children are exposed to. More and better experience in the real world. To ensure healthy social maturation, children must accumulate vast experience navigating real-world embodied interactions. Unstructured play and community involvement must take precedence over solitary digital consumption. Parents must actively work to dismantle the culture of overprotection by incrementally introducing independence. This begins with simple, untethered excursions. Parents should practice sending their children on minor errands without a tracking device or a smartphone. Trusting a child to walk to a local store builds profound mutual confidence. Encouraging sleepovers, strictly without digital devices, and organizing walking groups for the school commute further normalizes independence. The hours after school should be fiercely protected for unstructured free play, resisting the modern urge to pack every afternoon with adult-led enrichment classes. Furthermore, families should seek out environments that inherently demand self-reliance, such as camping trips or device-free sleepaway camps. In these settings, separated from the constant surveillance of anxious parents, children are forced to rely on their peers, navigate minor physical risks, and forge deep, resilient bonds. Ultimately, if a neighborhood lacks a vibrant play culture, parents must take the initiative to create one, organizing regular block parties or designated play hours to signal to the community that children are welcome and safe in the public square. The antidote to parental anxiety is exposure. As parents witness their children successfully navigating the world, the urge to hover naturally dissipates. Less and better. Experience on screens. While digital tools become necessary for academic work during these years, the recreational use of screens often expands to consume every available moment of leisure time. Because the vast majority of this consumption is purely entertainment, parents must establish firm boundaries to mitigate the massive opportunity costs. Establishing a daily limit on recreational screen time is essential. Without a hard ceiling, the addictive algorithms will inevitably encroach upon time meant for physical activity, face-to-face socializing, and sleep. While total hours matter, parents must prioritize the preservation of sleep and in-person connection above all else. If a child is thriving socially, engaging in sports, and resting well, rigid screen limits can occasionally be relaxed. However, the daily structure must remain clear. Meals and bedtimes must be rigorously protected as phone-free zones, and families should actively implement digital Sabbaths to break the cycle of constant connectivity. Crucially, parents must remain vigilant for signs of behavioral addiction, such as deceptive behavior regarding screen time, withdrawal from physical friendships, or extreme irritability when separated from devices. If these signs emerge, a prolonged digital detox is required to reset the child's neurological reward pathways. Most importantly, parents must hold the line against social media until the age of 16. While preteens will inevitably encounter the internet, allowing them to open personalized, algorithmically driven broadcasting accounts during the most vulnerable years of puberty is a profound developmental risk. For parents of teens ages 13 to 18, high school, the commencement of high school represents a major developmental threshold, a time when adolescents should experience a significant expansion of both freedom and responsibility. As the neurological architecture of the frontal cortex matures, young adults become increasingly capable of exercising self-control and managing complex real-world risks. More and better experience in the real world. During these years, the primary objective is to tether the adolescent firmly to the physical world, counteracting the pervasive sense of uselessness engineered by the digital age. Parents should aggressively expand their teenagers' mobility, encouraging the use of public transit and the acquisition of a driver's license. Teens desperately require third places, physical locations separate from home and school where they can socialize organically without adult interference. Within the home, adolescents must be relied upon for meaningful contributions. Assigning significant domestic responsibilities not only builds competence but also fosters essential empathy, transforming the parent-teen dynamic from one of service to one of partnership. Beyond the family, encouraging part-time employment is vital. Navigating the demands of a boss, managing interpersonal workplace friction, and earning an independent wage provides an unparalleled education in anti-fragility. Furthermore, adolescents must be given opportunities to nurture and lead. Taking on roles as camp counselors, babysitters, or athletic coaches activates innate capacities for empathy and responsibility. Parents should also actively support participation in exchange programs, wilderness expeditions, or gap years. These immersive, challenging experiences force young adults out of their comfortable digital silos, demanding resilience, cross-cultural understanding, and profound self-discovery. The goal is to provide the necessary friction that transforms a dependent child into a capable, self-governing adult. Less and better experience on screens. While the high school years demand a gradual loosening of digital restrictions, parents must remain actively engaged in guiding their teenagers' technological habits. The transition from a basic phone to a fully functional smartphone should be accompanied by ongoing dialogue regarding the immense power and potential pitfalls of the device. The preservation of sleep remains paramount. The habit of scrolling through social feeds immediately before sleep and immediately upon waking is highly destructive and must be actively discouraged. When adolescents do eventually enter the realm of social media, parents must maintain open communication about the psychological mechanics of these platforms, teaching them to recognize the manipulative nature of algorithmic feeds and the toxic reality of online social comparison. Finally, parents must critically examine their own reliance on the surveillance capabilities of modern smartphones. While the ability to track a child's precise location provides a seductive sense of parental security, it functions as an invisible leash, subtly undermining the adolescent's sense of autonomy and the parent's capacity for genuine trust. True maturation requires the space to make independent decisions, make mistakes, and navigate the consequences without the immediate intervention of a digital safety net. In sum, navigating the complexities of modern parenthood requires a deliberate rejection of the intense, fear-driven carpenter mentality. To cultivate a generation capable of thriving in the real world, parents must embrace the role of the gardener, providing a secure foundation while actively encouraging chaotic, brilliant, real-world growth. In the physical realm, this demands a massive reinvestment in unsupervised free play and the systematic dismantling of overprotection. Children must be granted the independence to roam, take manageable risks, and discover their own competence. In the virtual realm, parents must act as vigilant gatekeepers, delaying the introduction of smartphones and social media to protect the delicate, experience-expectant brain during its most sensitive developmental windows. By prioritizing embodied real-world community over disembodied digital networks, and by coordinating these efforts with other families, parents can break the collective action trap and restore the vital, anti-fragile nature of human childhood.